Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the suffocating darkness of pre-electric winters. Those endless nights when sunset at 4:30 p.m. meant you were basically imprisoned in your own home until morning. You're about to discover what 14 hours of darkness actually feels like when there's no phone to scroll, no light switch to flick, and absolutely nothing to do but sit in the semi-dark with your entire family, doing the same tedious tasks you did yesterday and will do again tomorrow. Before we sink into this cozy nightmare, here's your reality check. You probably wouldn't last 3 days in these conditions without losing your mind from sheer boredom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing the Worldwide Insomnia Club check-in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at your farmhouse door on a December afternoon in, say, 1780. The sun sits fat and orange on the horizon, and you know, with the certainty of someone who's lived through 40 winters, that you have maybe 20 minutes of usable twilight left. Your pulse actually quickens. This isn't dramatic. This is survival math. Your husband is already jogging toward the woodshed, arms loaded with tomorrow's fuel supply. Your daughter sprints to the chicken coop, shooing the hens inside before a fox gets ideas. Your son pumps water frantically at the well, filling every bucket and pitcher in the house because once darkness falls, venturing outside becomes genuinely dangerous. You can't see the tree root that'll snap your ankle. You can't spot the ice patch that'll crack your skull. And your nearest neighbour, the one who might hear you scream, lives a quarter-mile away through woods that feel very, very different after sunset. Historians still argue whether pre-industrial people felt genuine anxiety during these twilight scrambles or simply accepted it as routine, but the written record suggests plenty of both. Diaries mention the panic before dark, often enough that it clearly wasn't just a casual concern. Inside, you're doing your own frantic inventory. Candles, you've got 8 tallow stubs that'll give you maybe 3 hours of combined light if you're stingy. Rushlight, a bundle of dried reeds soaked in animal fat sits ready, though they burn fast and smell like rendering day at the butcher. Oil lamp, half full, and you're saving that for an emergency because lamp oil cost actual money, the kind you see maybe twice a year. The quirky reality that modern people forget. Winter darkness didn't arrive gradually for most of human history. Without electric lights creating a buffer zone of artificial dusk, the transition from can see to cannot see happened violently fast. 1 minute you're squinting at your needlework. 5 minutes later you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. The human eye adjusts, sure, but it never adjusts enough to read, write, or do fine motor work without a flame nearby. Your younger children are already getting that caged animal energy. They've been indoors since yesterday's sunset, 14 hours, and now they're facing another 14-hour stretch. There's no go play in the yard option. There's barely a go to the other room option because the other room is pitch black and freezing since you only heat the main living space. They'll be underfoot all night, every night until April. You light the first candle of the evening and everyone unconsciously migrates toward it like moths. Not because they're cold, though they are, but because humans are hardwired to gather around light sources. That single flame becomes the center of your universe for the next 12 to 14 hours. Everything else fades into shadow zones of varying usability. And here's the kicker that'll haunt you all winter. You've got roughly 120 nights like this ahead of you. 120 nights of sitting in the semi-dark, doing make-work tasks to stay sane, watching that candle burn down while you ration every minute of light like a miser counting coins. Some nights the monotony will feel like drowning. Other nights, the ones where someone gets sick or a storm knocks tiles off the roof, you'll wish desperately for boring. Your husband bars the door, not locks it, bars it with a heavy wooden beam. Because darkness brings different rules, and those rules involve keeping what's outside firmly outside. The long night has begun. The fire in your hearth isn't a cozy decorative feature. It's a demanding, temperamental tyrant that will dominate your entire winter existence. You crouch in front of it now, feeding it a fresh log, watching sparks spiral up the chimney. This fire cannot go out. Not tonight, not tomorrow night, not for the next 4 months, because restarting a fire from scratch involves either striking flint and steel for 20 frustrating minutes Or, more realistically, walking to a neighbour's house to borrow hot coals in a covered pot, which means admitting to everyone that you let your hearth die like some kind of incompetent peasant. So you feed it. Constantly. Your grandmother used to say the fire was the 8th family member, and she wasn't being poetic. It needs attention every 30 to 40 minutes. It needs the right size logs at the right time. It needs poking and stirring and rearranging. It produces ash that must be swept out daily, but also saved for soap making, so now you have ash management as a household task. It consumes roughly 1 full tree per month, which means someone spent autumn sawing and splitting all that wood, and someone else has to haul it inside every single day. The fireplace opening is huge, maybe 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, because it has to radiate enough heat to keep a 20 by 20 foot room tolerably warm, not comfortable, tolerably. Which means if you're sitting directly in front of it, your face might actually be too hot while your back is freezing. The temperature gradient in this room is genuinely absurd. 3 feet from the fire, 60 degrees. 6 feet away, 45. The corner where the children sleep, probably 38 degrees. And yes, they're under a pile of quilts that weighs more than they do. Everyone arranges themselves in a semicircle facing the flames, like some kind of ritualistic gathering, which, honestly, it kind of is. Your husband sits closest with his whittling knife and a chunk of maple, shaving off curls that occasionally catch the light. Your mother-in-law occupies the second best spot with her knitting needles clicking in a rhythm that's been the soundtrack to your marriage. The children squeeze wherever they can, usually too close, until you bark at them to back up before they singe their clothes. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Wealthy families sometimes installed andirons with decorative figures on them, and archaeologists have found examples where these figures were positioned to look like they were warming themselves at the fire. Essentially, rich people gave their fireplace irons little companion statues so the fire wouldn't feel lonely. Priorities. The light the fire provides is complicated. It's bright enough that you can see faces clearly within 6 feet. Beyond that, everything dissolves into flickering orange shadows that play tricks on your peripheral vision. You'll swear you saw someone move in the corner. Nope, just shadow puppets created by the flames. This is why every ghost story humanity ever invented sounds more plausible by firelight. Your brain literally cannot process the visual information correctly. Historians still argue whether firelight's limited range actually increased family bonding or just forced proximity that people would have avoided if given the choice. Medieval and early modern letters contain surprisingly few warm references to gathering by the hearth. It was just what you did, like breathing. Reading by firelight is technically possible but practically miserable. You have to hold the book at exactly the right angle to catch the light, which means your arms get tired after 10 minutes. The text seems to swim and blur as the flames dance, and heaven forbid you're reading something important, because you'll give yourself a screaming headache within half an hour. This is why literacy rates and eye problems were so closely correlated, not just from reading, but from reading in absolutely terrible lighting conditions. Your daughter shifts positions for the dozenth time, trying to find a spot that's not too hot or too cold. There isn't one. This is the fundamental problem with fire as your primary light and heat source. It's directional. It blasts heat forward and upward while everything else stays cold. You can't distribute it evenly. You can't adjust it with a thermostat. You either suffer the heat or suffer the cold, and usually you're suffering both simultaneously on different parts of your body. The fire pops, sending a coal skittering onto the hearthstone, and everyone flinches. This happens multiple times per night. You've got a designated fire poker for exactly this scenario, batting stray embers back into the firebox before they find something flammable. Like that time your neighbour's daughter's skirt caught fire because she stood too close while daydreaming. She survived, but the burn scars probably helped her remember to pay attention afterward. And speaking of paying attention, you cannot leave this fire unsupervised for long. Not with children nearby. Not with all these flammable textiles everywhere. Not with your exhausted husband who might doze off mid-whittling and drop wood shavings into the flames. Entire villages have burned down because someone got careless with their hearth fire on a winter night. The fire keeps you alive, yes. It also might kill you if you disrespect it. So you sit there, all of you, orbiting this controlled inferno like planets around a sun, doing whatever small tasks can be accomplished in its wavering light, listening to it crackle and hiss, watching shadows dance on the walls, and trying not to think about how many more hours until dawn. The fire doesn't care, it just wants more wood. Your mother-in-law's spinning wheel starts up with its familiar creak and whir, and you know that sound will continue, with only brief pauses, until she finally surrenders to sleep around midnight. The wheel sits angled toward the fire to catch maximum light, though maximum is generous. She's basically spinning by muscle memory and feel more than sight. Her fingers guide the wool fibres onto the spindle with the unconscious precision of someone who's done this approximately 8,000 times per winter for the past 40 years. You've got your own textile nightmare tonight. Mending. Again, always mending. The basket beside you contains 14 items that need attention. Your husband's work shirt with the torn sleeve, your son's stockings with holes at both heels, the household linens that are developing weak spots from repeated washing, a petticoat with a seam that's given up entirely. This basket never empties. You fix something, wear it for 3 days, and it comes back damaged in a new location. It's like playing whack-a-mole with deteriorating fabric. You thread your needle by firelight, which requires holding both needle and thread at precisely the right angle to see the eye, squinting until your forehead hurts, and muttering several unchristian words under your breath when you miss for the 4th time. Modern people don't appreciate how much of pre-industrial life involved squinting at small objects in terrible lighting. Half the wise old crones in historical illustrations probably just needed reading. Glasses, but were instead labelled witches for peering at things oddly. Your daughter has joined the textile brigade with her own small spinning project, carding wool. She's got 2 paddle-shaped boards covered in small wire teeth, and she's dragging raw wool between them to align the fibres before spinning. It's mind-numbingly repetitive work that produces a substance that looks disturbingly like dryer lint. This is what passes for entertainment when you're 12 years old in 1780. Card wool or stare at the fire. Those are your options. Here's the mainstream historical reality. The average pre-industrial household spent roughly 30 to 40% of their winter evening hours on textile production and maintenance. Not because they loved it, but because clothing was phenomenally expensive. A good wool coat cost the equivalent of 2 months' wages for a labourer. You couldn't just pop over to the store and buy replacements. If your family needed clothing, you made it. From scratch. Starting with raw wool on a sheep's back and ending with a finished garment anywhere from 6 months to a year later. The spinning wheel's rhythm is hypnotic. Whir, click, click, whir. Your mother-in-law's foot pumps the treadle while her hands dance through the motions of drafting fibre and guiding it onto the spindle. She can do this in the dark, has done it in the dark when fuel was scarce, but the firelight at least lets her see major problems before they become disasters. A broken thread now means 10 minutes of restarting. A tangle means half an hour of picking apart fibres with your fingernails. Historians still argue whether women found this work meditative or soul-crushing. Some diaries describe spinning as peaceful thinking time. Others describe it as wrist-breaking drudgery that left women with chronic pain and deformed fingers. Probably both were true, depending on the woman and the day and how many thousands of yards of thread she still needed to produce before spring. Your needle flashes in the firelight. In, out, pull tight, repeat. You're doing a running stitch on the shirt sleeve, trying to make it neat enough that your husband won't complain, but not so neat that you waste an hour on perfectionism. The fabric is coarse wool that catches on your calloused fingertips. You've got a permanent groove worn into your middle finger from decades of pushing needles through thick cloth. Every woman you know has the same groove. It's like a membership badge for the sisterhood of never-ending textile maintenance. And speaking of never-ending, that stockpile of raw wool in the corner represents about 3 months of winter spinning. 3 months. Your mother-in-law will transform those greasy dirt-filled fleeces into usable yarn, and then you'll transform that yarn into actual fabric on your loom, and then you'll cut and sew that fabric into clothing that your family will promptly destroy through normal wear, and then you'll start the whole cycle over. Again, it's like Sisyphus, but with sheep. Here's your delightfully quirky historical detail. Wealthy women sometimes hosted spinning parties, where a dozen ladies would bring their wheels to someone's large parlor and spin together while gossiping. This was considered prime entertainment. Imagine getting dressed up to go to someone's house specifically to do your textile chores in a group setting. Although, honestly, given how isolated rural life was, maybe collective wool spinning really was the social highlight of the week. At least you weren't alone with your thoughts and a pile of sheep hair. Your daughter abandons the wool cards, her arms are tired, and picks up some darning. She's working on a sock that's more hole than sock at this point, weaving new yarn across the gap like she's creating a tiny textile bridge. She holds it close to the fire, tilting it to catch light, and you see her squinting the same way you were squinting earlier. The next generation, learning to destroy their eyesight in the family tradition. The spinning wheel whirs on, your needle flashes, the fire crackles. Somewhere in this room is probably enough raw wool, unfinished projects, and mending to keep all of you occupied until Easter. And you know, with the grim certainty of experience, that by the time you finish this basket of mending, you'll have generated another basket's worth of new tears, weak seams, and catastrophic holes. The thread supply never runs out, neither does the work. The kitchen corner of your main room never truly sleeps, even when you want to. While your mother-in-law spins and you mend, there's still that pile of dried corn kernels sitting in a wooden bowl, silently judging you. They need to become cornmeal by tomorrow afternoon, which means someone has to spend the next 2 hours grinding them in the hand quern. A task so repetitive and arm-destroying that families usually rotate through members like a very boring tag team. Tonight, it's your turn. You settle the heavy stone grinder between your knees, pour a handful of kernels into the centre, and start the circular grinding motion that you'll be doing until your shoulders scream for mercy. The stones scrape against each other with a gritty whisper, and coarse meal starts trickling out the bottom into your collection bowl. This is maybe the most mind-numbing task humanity ever invented. Round and round and round, crushing grain that could have been crushed yesterday or could be crushed tomorrow, but no. It has to be tonight, because tomorrow you'll be grinding different grain or churning butter, or doing one of 17 other food prep tasks that apparently cannot wait. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The average pre-industrial household spent between 4 to 6 hours per day on food preparation and preservation, and winter nights absorbed a huge chunk of that labour. You couldn't exactly process food outside when it was dark at 4:30 p.m, so the work shifted indoors into these endless evening sessions where you ground and churned and chopped by firelight while pretending you weren't going slowly insane. Your husband glances over at the butter churn sitting ominously in the corner, tomorrow night's problem, and you see him mentally calculating whether he can avoid that particular task. He cannot. Butter doesn't churn itself, and your daughter isn't strong enough yet to manage the full process. So tomorrow he'll sit there pumping that wooden plunger up and down for 90 minutes, while his whittling projects gather dust and his soul quietly withers. But tonight you've got grain duty, so round and round you go, adding more kernels when the grinding gets easier, feeling the stone heat up from friction against stone. Your arms are already tired from mending, and now they're getting a completely different kind of tired. The deep muscle ache that comes from repetitive circular motion. You'll feel this in your shoulders tomorrow, and the day after, and probably for the rest of your life, because you've been doing this since you were tall enough to reach the grinding stones. Over by the fire, your son is working on tomorrow's bread dough. Technically tonight's bread dough, since it needs to rise for hours before baking. He's kneading the mass of flour and water with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that only a 10-year-old boy can bring to a task. Slam, fold, push, turn. Slam, fold, push, turn. The dough makes satisfying slapping sounds against the wooden board. At least someone's enjoying their food prep. Historians still argue whether the extremely labour-intensive nature of food preparation actually resulted in better nutrition, or if people were simply too exhausted from preparing food to enjoy eating it. The caloric output required to grind enough grain for one day's bread probably ate up a significant portion of that bread's nutritional value. You were basically exercising to create food to fuel more exercise to create more food. The circle of pre-industrial life. Here's your delightfully weird, quirky detail. Some households designated specific nights for specific food tasks, creating a weekly rotation that everyone memorized. Monday was churning night. Tuesday was grain grinding. Wednesday was meat salting, and so on. This wasn't efficiency. This was survival strategy. Because if you tried to do everything at once, you'd lose your mind. Spreading the misery across the week made it fractionally more bearable. You dump another handful of corn into the quern, and a kernel escapes, bouncing across the floor into the shadows. You're not going after it. That kernel is dead to you now. Somewhere in the darkness of this room, there's probably a small pile of escaped food items that you've mentally written off as casualties of nighttime food prep. spilled flour, dropped beans, that one potato that rolled under the storage chest 3 weeks ago, and is presumably growing sentient down there. Your daughter has moved on from darning to chopping dried apples for tomorrow's porridge. She's got a knife and a wooden board, working by feel as much as sight since the firelight barely reaches her corner. Every winter you live in low-grade fear that someone will cut themselves during one of these poorly lit food prep sessions, but miraculously it rarely happens. Humans are surprisingly good at not stabbing themselves when they've been doing the same task in the dark for months on end. The butter churn looms in your peripheral vision like a wooden threat. Inside it, cream is slowly souring, transforming into the perfect churning consistency. Tomorrow night, or possibly later tonight if someone gets ambitious, that cream will need to be agitated for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on temperature and luck, and whether the dairy gods are feeling merciful. The repetitive up-down motion of churning is different from the circular motion of grinding, which means you'll get to experience a whole new flavour of arm fatigue. Variety. Your husband has moved on to checking the salted meat hanging near the ceiling, pork strips that are slowly curing in the dry air near the chimney. He prods one experimentally, checking for the right firmness. Too soft means it's not ready. Too hard means you waited too long and now you're eating leather. There's a brief window of correct, and hitting it requires the kind of intuitive knowledge that comes from years of making mistakes and eating the evidence. The grinding continues. Your arms continue their circular motion. The stone continues its gritty scraping. And somewhere in your exhausted brain, you're already mentally cataloguing tomorrow night's tasks. Churning, more grinding, bread baking, vegetable chopping, meat checking, and probably something you're forgetting that'll surprise you at the last minute. The corn slowly, grudgingly becomes meal, kernel by kernel, hour by hour, night after winter night. Your husband finally calls a halt to the various grinding, chopping and kneading operations around the room, not because the work is done, it's never done, but because it's time for evening prayers. You brush cornmeal dust off your skirt and abandon the quern mid-grind because arguing with the household prayer schedule is not an option. God's time supersedes corn grinding time, apparently. Everyone shuffles into position. Your family doesn't kneel. The floor is too cold and your knees are too old for that kind of performance piety. But you do bow your heads while your husband leads the recitation. His voice takes on that particular tone that men use when they're speaking on behalf of the household to the Almighty. Formal, slightly pompous, like he's negotiating a business contract with heaven. The prayers are in Latin, which none of you actually understand except for your husband, who had 2 years of schooling before his father died and he had to take over the farm. He rattles through the Pater Noster and Ave Maria with the confidence of someone who memorized the sounds 40 years ago and has never questioned what they mean. Your daughter mouths along, getting maybe 60% of the syllables right. Your son stares into the fire, clearly thinking about literally anything else. This isn't casual spirituality. This is structural religion, the kind that divides your evening into manageable segments and gives you permission to stop working for 15 minutes. Morning prayers, midday prayers, evening prayers, and, if you're particularly devout or particularly trying to impress the neighbours, compline before bed. The day doesn't flow naturally. It lurches from one prayer appointment to the next, and honestly, the rhythm is probably what keeps you sane. Without these mandatory pauses, you just work yourself into the ground night after night. Here's your mainstream historical reality. Religious observance in pre-industrial households wasn't primarily about spiritual enlightenment, it was about time management and social control. The church bells that rang throughout the day, back when you could hear them, before winter isolated you, told you when to pray, work, eat, and sleep. Prayers carved the shapeless darkness into defined chunks. First prayers meant early evening, second prayers meant deep night. Final prayers meant you could finally, mercifully go to bed. Your mother-in-law has produced her rosary beads, a worn wooden strand that she's been working through for decades. The beads are smooth from handling, darker where her fingers habitually grip. She doesn't look at them. She doesn't need to. Her fingers walk from bead to bead in the darkness, counting prayers by touch alone, her lips moving silently through Hail Marys while the rest of you finish the communal recitation. Historians still argue whether this kind of rote prayer provided genuine comfort or simply became another tedious task that people performed out of obligation. Some personal letters from the era describe prayer as a refuge from daily hardship. Others describe it as one more exhausting requirement in an already exhausting existence. Probably, as usual, the truth depends on the person and the day, and whether they'd gotten enough sleep. Your husband reaches for the family Bible, the single most expensive object in this room, worth more than your table, chairs, and bed combined. It lives wrapped in cloth on the highest shelf, safe from children's hands and accidental spills. He unwraps it with ceremony, carries it to his seat near the fire, and opens to... well, honestly, you're not sure where he opens to. Could be Psalms, could be Proverbs, could be that same passage from Luke he's read 17 times this winter because it's easy to find and sounds appropriately serious. He reads aloud in English now, his voice shifting from the Latin prayer voice to his regular speaking voice, which somehow makes the whole thing feel less holy and more like a grandfather telling a story, which you suppose it kind of is. The text is about servants and masters and faithful stewardship, which seems pointed given that your son has been shirking his barn chores lately, but maybe you're reading too much into the selection. Here's your wonderfully specific, quirky detail. Wealthy families sometimes owned Bible boxes, ornate wooden containers specifically designed to hold the family Bible and display it prominently. These boxes had locks. People literally locked up their Bibles like they were state secrets or treasure maps. Partially because Bibles were genuinely valuable, but also because controlling access to Scripture meant controlling religious interpretation, and parents did not want their teenage children getting weird ideas from unsupervised Bible reading. Knowledge is dangerous apparently, even when it's holy knowledge. Your daughter is counting her own makeshift rosary, a string of dried beans that she threaded last autumn during a burst of religious enthusiasm that lasted approximately 3 days. She's doing the full 5-decade rosary, which means she'll be there for 20 minutes, silently mouthing prayers while her fingers move from bean to bean. You can see her occasionally lose count, pause, appear to do mental math, then continue with renewed confidence that she's definitely on bead 43 and not bead 37. The Bible reading continues. Your husband has found his rhythm now, speaking with that particular cadence that men use when reading scripture aloud, slightly slower, more emphasis on random words, occasional dramatic pauses that probably aren't in the original text. Your son is still staring into the fire, but now he's at least facing in the general direction of his father, which counts as participation. And here's the thing about these evening devotions. They're genuinely one of the few times each day when you're not actively producing something. You're not spinning, grinding, mending, churning, or maintaining anything. You're just sitting still, listening to ancient words, letting your mind drift where it wants to drift, maybe actually praying, or maybe just enjoying the authorized break from labor. It's like a mandatory rest period enforced by divine command, which is probably the only kind of rest your husband would actually take. Your mother-in-law's fingers continue their steady journey through the rosary beads. Click, click, click. Tiny wooden sounds barely audible over the fire's crackling. She's on her 3rd decade now, or maybe her 4th. She's done this so many times that her fingers could complete the circuit while she's fully asleep, which, based on the way her head is nodding, might be happening right now. The reading ends. Your husband closes the Bible with appropriate reverence, rewraps it in its protective cloth, returns it to the high shelf. Everyone murmurs "Amen" in that exhausted, relieved tone that means, thank God that's over, can we go back to our tasks now? But you've got maybe 2 more hours before bed, and those hours won't fill themselves. So back to the grinding, the churning, the mending, the endless maintenance of existence. At least you've got God's blessing on it now. Or at least you've got permission to stop feeling guilty about working on the Sabbath. Close enough. The children last approximately 11 minutes in post-prayer stillness before the fidgeting begins. Your son shifts position, then shifts again, then starts drumming his fingers on his knee in a rhythm that's designed to be just quiet enough that he can claim innocence when you glare at him. Your daughter sighs dramatically, the kind of theatrical exhale that only preteens can produce, and announces to no one in particular that she's so bored. Welcome to every parent's winter nightmare. Children with energy, darkness that prevents outdoor play, and roughly 5 more hours until bedtime. Your husband tries to redirect them toward productive activity. Why don't you practice your letters, he suggests, which is adorable because he's apparently forgotten that writing by firelight requires candles. You're not willing to waste on penmanship practice, and also because suggesting homework has never once in human history made a bored child less bored. Your son counters with, "Can we play shadows?" and suddenly both children are scrambling toward the fire before you can object, hands already forming shapes in the flickering light. A dog appears on the wall, or maybe a rabbit, it's hard to tell. Then something that might be a bird or might be a demon, depending on your perspective and how tired you are. Your daughter creates an elaborate horse that transforms into a dragon mid-gallop, and both children dissolve into giggles that echo too loud in the small space. Here's your mainstream historical fact that'll make modern parents feel slightly better about screen time. Children in pre-industrial households were genuinely, chronically understimulated during winter months. They couldn't go outside after dark. They couldn't read without wasting expensive light. They couldn't play most physical games in cramped spaces. They were essentially trapped indoors with the same 4 people, doing the same boring tasks night after night after night, and the resulting cabin fever was absolutely real. Some historical accounts describe children becoming genuinely difficult to manage by February, crying more, fighting more, regressing in behaviour, purely from the monotony. The shadow puppets evolve into a full theatrical production, complete with voices. Your son is doing a surprisingly good impression of the local priest, which is borderline blasphemous but also genuinely funny, so you pretend not to notice. Your daughter has created a shadow princess who seems to be negotiating with a shadow dragon, and the negotiation involves a lot of dramatic hand gestures that send wild shapes dancing across the wall. Your mother-in-law, still clutching her rosary, actually cracks a smile. Small victories. But shadow puppets hold attention for maybe 20 minutes before someone gets aggressive with their hand movements and accidentally punches someone else's shadow creature. And now there's a dispute about whether that counts as cheating, and your husband has to intervene with the kind of exhausted authority that says he'd rather be literally anywhere else. Rhyming game, you announce, which is code for please God find something that doesn't require movement or light. This is an old favourite that your mother taught you, and her mother taught her, going back probably to medieval times when bored peasants had to invent entertainment from literally nothing. The rules are simple. Someone says a word, the next person rhymes it, and you go around the circle until someone fails or repeats. Your daughter starts with cat, which leads to rat, bat, hat, mat, fat, sat, and then your son tries splat, which sparks a debate about whether that's a real word or just a sound. You allow it because the alternative is listening to them argue for 15 minutes about linguistics. Historians still argue whether these oral word games actually improved vocabulary and linguistic skills, or if they were just noise-making to fill the void. Some educational historians claim they were crucial for literacy development. Others point out that rhyming cat 47 different ways probably didn't make anyone smarter. Here's your delightfully specific, quirky, historical detail. Wealthy families sometimes hired young servants whose primary job was keeping the children occupied during winter evenings. These weren't tutors or nannies in the modern sense. They were basically professional playmates, usually teenagers themselves, employed specifically to absorb the relentless energy of bored children, so the adults could work in peace. Imagine getting paid to play rhyming games and shadow puppets. Although, given that you'd be doing it for 6 hours straight every night in a freezing dark room, maybe it wasn't such a great job after all. The rhyming game peters out when your son gets stuck on orange and refuses to admit defeat, instead insisting that door hinge absolutely counts and you're all being unfair. Your husband suggests hide and seek, which seems insane given the limited space, but the children are already scrambling into position before you can voice objections. Your daughter volunteers to seek first, covers her eyes, and starts counting to 50 while your son frantically looks for hiding spots in a room that has maybe 3 viable options. He settles for crouching behind the butter churn, which doesn't hide him at all. You can literally see his entire head and shoulders. But your daughter has agreed to pretend the semi-darkness makes things challenging. So she counts slowly and makes exaggerated, where could he be? Noises while walking directly past him twice. The game becomes less about actual hiding, and more about the ritual of seeking and finding, the familiar call and response that fills time and burns energy. Your daughter hides behind the wood stack. Your son hides under the table, which barely conceals him. They take turns being dramatically surprised when found, squealing with delight that seems disproportionate to the actual game but is really about having permission to make noise and move around after hours of forced stillness. But you know what's coming next because you've survived 40 winters of this, the whispered mischief phase. The children will huddle together in the darkest corner, giggling about something, speaking too quietly for you to hear properly. They'll be planning something. maybe stealing an extra piece of bread from tomorrow's loaf, maybe trying to stay awake past bedtime, maybe just sharing jokes that only make sense to children, the kind of humour that loses all meaning when explained to adults. You let it happen because the alternative is breaking up their fun and dealing with the sulking that follows. And honestly, their whispered plotting is kind of sweet in a way that you'll never admit out loud. They're creating their own small rebellion against the monotony, their own secret world within the boundaries of this room, this firelight, this endless winter night. Your mother-in-law catches your eye and smiles knowingly. She raised 7 children through winters like this. She understands that sometimes the best parenting strategy is strategic. Ignorance. Let them have their whispered secrets. Let them feel like they're getting away with something. Let them find joy in the cracks of boredom. The fire crackles. The children whisper. Another hour passes into the dark. Your husband reaches for the reading material. Tonight it's a 3-week-old newspaper that a neighbour passed along after he'd finished with it, which means you're getting your news approximately 21 days after it stopped being news. But in a world where information travels at the speed of horse, 3 weeks old is practically current events. He settles into his chair near the fire, angles the paper to catch maximum light, and clears his throat in that self-important way that means he's about to perform literacy for an audience. "Should I read the shipping reports?" he asks, which is his way of pretending you have input while fully intending to read whatever he wants. "Please, anything but grain prices," you mutter, because last week he spent 45 minutes reading commodity market fluctuations from a port city you'll never visit, discussing wheat futures like they were thrilling adventure tales. He ignores you and starts with local news, a fire in town, a dispute over property boundaries, someone's pig that escaped and caused chaos in the marketplace. His reading voice is different from his prayer voice and his regular voice. It's measured, slightly theatrical, with pauses for emphasis that sometimes land and sometimes make him sound like he's having a stroke mid-sentence. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Communal reading aloud became explosively popular in the 18th century as literacy rates climbed and printed materials became more accessible. By the 1780s, even relatively poor households might have access to newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, and cheap novels through a complex web of borrowing, sharing, and passing along. One newspaper might serve an entire village, travelling from household to household, getting more tattered and illegible with each reading until someone finally used it to line a drawer or start a fire. Your hands return to mending. You're a professional multitasker at this point, while your ears track the news. The children have abandoned their whispering to listen, because even boring adult news is better than sitting in silence. Your mother-in-law's knitting needles maintain their rhythm, but you can tell she's listening by the way her head tilts slightly toward your husband's voice. This is the magic of communal reading. It transforms individual literacy into group entertainment. Your husband is the only one in this room who can read fluently, but his skill becomes everyone's resource. He's not just reading for himself, he's performing a service, translating written words into shared experience. It's like being a human podcast, except the content is 3 weeks old, and occasionally interrupted by him stopping to sound out difficult words. Historians still argue whether this communal reading actually educated illiterate family members, or simply entertained them without transferring actual reading skills. Some scholars point to increasing literacy rates and suggest that hearing texts aloud helped people learn letter sounds and word patterns. Others argue that passive listening is completely different from active reading, and that most illiterate listeners remained illiterate regardless of how many hours they spent hearing newspapers read aloud. Your husband finishes the news section and moves to the advertisements, which are honestly more entertaining. Someone is selling a miraculous cure for all ailments, probably liquefied sheep dung mixed with alcohol. Another ad seeks a runaway apprentice, described as surly of disposition and prone to theft, which seems like information that should have come up before the apprenticeship started. A third announces that a travelling preacher will visit the area in spring, ready to save souls and probably collect donations. "Should I read the serial?" your husband asks, holding up the paper's back page where a continued story has been running for weeks. "Yes," your daughter shouts, suddenly animated. She's been following this particular tale, something about a virtuous maiden and a mysterious inheritance, and probably a villain with a moustache, because these stories always have villains with moustaches, even when moustaches aren't explicitly described. Here's your gloriously specific quirky detail. Serial fiction in newspapers was so popular that some families would delay reading the latest installment for days, saving it as a special treat for when morale was particularly low. Imagine having the conclusion to a cliffhanger sitting in your house and deliberately not reading it because you needed something to look forward to on Wednesday. The delayed gratification was apparently worth the suspense-induced suffering. Your husband begins the story with significantly more enthusiasm than he brought to the grain prices. He does different voices for different characters, a high pitch for the maiden, a gruff rumble for the villain, a pompous tone for the lawyer. It's actually impressive in a community theatre sort of way. Your daughter is riveted, leaning forward, mending Forgotten in her lap. The story is predictably melodramatic. The maiden has discovered a letter that may prove her noble birth. The villain is scheming to steal her inheritance. The handsome stranger who arrived 2 installments ago is definitely going to save the day, but not before several more weeks of complications. It's trash literature, basically, but it's your trash literature, and everyone in this room will be discussing theories and predictions for the next week. Your son, who claimed to be uninterested, is also clearly listening. You can tell because he's stopped fidgeting and his eyes have gone slightly unfocused, in that way that means his imagination is building the scenes his father describes. This is how stories worked before movies and television, pure theatre of the mind conjured from words spoken in firelight. Your husband reaches the end of this week's installment, which naturally ends on a cliffhanger. The maiden has opened a mysterious door and found to be continued. Your daughter actually groans out loud in frustration, which seems like exactly the response the writer was hoping for. "Can we read something else?" your son asks, eyeing the small shelf where you keep the household's 3 books. The Bible, already had our fill tonight, an old almanac from 1776 that's wildly out of date, but contains useful information about moon phases and planting times, and a copy of Robinson Crusoe that your husband won in a card game 15 years ago and has read aloud approximately 40 times. "We're not reading Crusoe again," you announce preemptively, because you cannot endure another dramatic recitation of the footprint scene. You've heard it enough times to have it memorized. Your husband looks wounded, as if you've personally attacked his favourite book, which you kind of have. He compromises by reading from the almanac, weather predictions that are years old, astronomical information that's probably still accurate, and a collection of useful household hints that range from genuinely helpful to absolutely deranged. Apparently you can cure warts by rubbing them with stolen bacon. You can predict the sex of unborn children by dangling a ring over the pregnant woman's belly. You can ward off evil spirits by placing shoes upside down by the door, which explains that weird thing your grandmother used to do. Your mother-in-law perks up at this. "My mother swore by the bacon trick," she announces, as if this proves anything other than that superstition runs deep in your family line. The reading continues. Your hands continue their work. The fire continues crackling. And for a little while, the room feels less like a prison of darkness and more like a small theatre, where one man's voice transforms ink on paper into shared imagination, entertainment, and something close to magic. Even if the news is 3 weeks old, and the villain is cartoonishly evil, and the household hints are medically questionable at best. At least it's better than staring at the fire in silence. The reading winds down, and your husband sets the newspaper aside with the satisfied air of someone who's fulfilled his cultural obligations for the evening. But the night is still young, by which you mean it's only 8 o'clock, and bedtime won't arrive for at least 3 more hours. So someone needs to propose the next activity before the children start getting restless again. Your mother-in-law solves the problem by retrieving her penny whistle from its spot on the mantel. It's a simple wooden tube with 6 holes, looks like something a child made in craft class, and produces sounds that range from pleasant to cat being strangled, depending on her mood and lung capacity. Tonight, mercifully, she's aiming for pleasant. She wets the mouthpiece, apparently this helps with tone, or maybe it's just habit, and launches into a folk tune that you've heard approximately 9,000 times. Something about a shepherd and a lost lamb, and probably a metaphor for Jesus, because folk songs are either about agriculture or salvation, with very little middle ground. Your husband doesn't need an invitation. He's already pulling his fiddle from its cloth wrapping, checking the strings, making those preliminary scratching sounds that fiddlers make while they pretend to tune, but are really just announcing, "I'm about to perform, everyone pay attention." The fiddle is older than your marriage, handed down from his father, and it's got the kind of worn patina that comes from decades of use and minimal maintenance. One string is slightly different coloured than the others, a replacement from 2 years ago when the original snapped mid-song and nearly took out his eye. Here's your mainstream historical fact that'll surprise modern people. Musical instrument ownership was remarkably common even among poor families. A fiddle, whistle, or simple drum weren't luxury items, they were practical tools for entertainment and community bonding. Surveys from the late 18th century suggest that roughly 60% of rural households owned at least one instrument, and many owned several. Music wasn't something you consumed passively, it was something you made together, because the alternative was sitting in silence, or listening to your children complain about boredom for the 9,000th time. Your husband and mother-in-law find their rhythm together, the fiddle and whistle weaving around each other in a melody that's probably older than anyone can remember. It's not concert-quality music. Your husband occasionally hits notes that are technically adjacent to the correct notes, and your mother-in-law's breath control isn't what it used to be, so she takes gasping breaks mid-phrase. But it fills the room with sound that isn't work-related. No grinding, no spinning, no scraping, just music for music's sake. Your daughter jumps up and retrieves the small hand drum from its corner, a circular frame with leather stretched across it, played by slapping it with your palm or fingers. She starts adding a beat to the melody, something simple and repetitive that mostly works with what her grandmother and father are playing. Mostly. Sometimes she's a half beat off, creating this weird syncopated effect that's either avant-garde genius or just wrong, depending on your tolerance for amateur percussion. And then, because this is how folk music works, everyone starts singing. The lyrics are about farming naturally, something about ploughing fields and sowing seeds and reaping harvests, with a chorus that goes, "Hey ho, the wind does blow," which doesn't scan properly but has been repeated for so many generations that no one questions it anymore. You join in because not joining in would be rude, and also because singing is genuinely one of the few free entertainments available that doesn't require tools, materials, or effort beyond opening your mouth. Your son attempts harmony on the chorus, which is ambitious given that he can barely hold the melody, but you appreciate the enthusiasm. He's doing that thing where he sings louder to compensate for being slightly off-key, which is a bold strategy that absolutely does not work but remains popular among teenage boys throughout history. Historians still argue whether communal music-making in pre-industrial households was primarily about entertainment or social cohesion, whether people played music because they enjoyed it or because it was one of the few ways to maintain family unity during long, isolated winters. Some anthropologists point to music as a crucial bonding mechanism. Others suggest that people were just bored and making noise was preferable to silence. Probably both are true, as usual. Here's your delightfully weird, quirky detail. Some communities developed elaborate singing traditions where families would compete to see who could hold a note longest, harmonize most precisely, or memorize the most verses of increasingly obscure folk songs. These weren't formal competitions with prizes, they were just neighbour bragging rights. Oh, the Johnsons think they can sing. Well, we know all 47 verses of the Derby Ram, including the controversial sheep theft verse that the church tried to ban. Rural life was apparently very intense about folk music preservation. The first song ends, and your husband immediately launches into another, this one faster. A jig or reel or whatever you call those bouncy tunes that make you want to dance, even though there's no room to dance, and also you're exhausted. Your mother-in-law struggles to keep up on the whistle, her fingers flying over the holes, occasionally missing and producing rogue notes that everyone politely ignores. Your daughter is fully committed to the drum now, slapping out an increasingly complex rhythm that may or may not match the actual song. Your son has grabbed 2 wooden spoons and is using them as makeshift percussion instruments, banging them together and against his knee and occasionally against the table when he wants extra emphasis. The noise level in this room has gone from quiet evening activities to barely controlled chaos in about 90 seconds. And you know what? It's kind of wonderful. This is the thing about homemade music that recorded music can never replicate. It's imperfect, chaotic, slightly out of tune, and absolutely irreplaceable. No two performances are identical. There's no rewind button, no perfect studio version to compare against. This specific combination of sounds in this specific room, with these specific people, will never exist again. It's ephemeral art created by amateurs, and it's genuinely one of the few times during these winter nights when everyone seems simultaneously engaged and happy. The jig ends in a ragged flourish. Your husband attempts a fancy finale that his fingers can't quite execute, but he commits to it anyway, soaring dramatically across the strings while your mother-in-law's whistle trails off into a breathless wheeze. Your daughter hits the drum one final time with ceremonial authority. Your son clangs the spoons together triumphantly. There's a moment of breathless silence, and then everyone's laughing. Not because anything was particularly funny, but because the sheer ridiculousness of your family band has finally hit you all at once. You're a group of exhausted farmers and homemakers sitting in a dimly lit room, making questionable music with ancient instruments, and somehow this counts as peak entertainment for the evening. Again, your daughter demands, because children have infinite energy for activities they actually enjoy. Your husband checks his fiddle strings. One of them is looking slightly frayed, which will become tomorrow's problem, and launches into a slower tune this time. Something romantic and melancholy about lovers separated by war or distance, or perhaps just poor transportation infrastructure. It's never entirely clear from folk song lyrics. This time, everyone knows the words, and the harmonies actually work. Your voice blends with your mother-in-law's surprisingly sturdy alto. Your husband sings while playing, his voice rough but steady. Even your son stays mostly on key, adding a lower harmony that actually sounds intentional rather than accidental. The fire crackles along with the music. The darkness beyond the firelight seems less oppressive when it's filled with sound. And for these few minutes, these brief, imperfect, slightly out-of-tune minutes, winter doesn't feel quite so endless. The music plays on, the night grows deeper, but at least it's not silent. The music session ends when your mother-in-law's breath gives out completely, and she needs to sit down before she passes out. Your husband carefully wraps his fiddle back in its cloth, and everyone settles into the pleasant exhaustion that follows amateur music making. But the evening's entertainment isn't quite finished, because you hear boots stomping outside, the distinctive pattern of someone trying to knock snow off their feet before entering, followed by a hesitant knock at the door. Your daughter's face transforms from tired to alert in approximately half a second. She knows that knock. That's Thomas from the neighbouring farm, the blacksmith's son with the decent jawline and questionable sense of humour, who's been casually stopping by 3 evenings a week since October, under increasingly transparent pretenses. Your husband opens the door with the kind of deliberate slowness that announces, "I'm the father, and I'm watching you," and Thomas stumbles in, bringing cold air and awkward energy. He's clutching a small bundle, probably firewood or turnips or some other pathetic excuse for a visit, and he's already sweating despite the temperature, because he knows he's about to spend the next 2 hours being scrutinized by your entire family while trying to court your daughter. Welcome to pre-industrial romance, where privacy is a fantasy, and every conversation happens in front of an audience of judgmental relatives. "Evening, sir," Thomas manages, addressing your husband with the kind of forced respect that young men use when they're terrified of fathers. "I brought kindling. Thought you might need kindling. You currently have enough kindling to burn for 3 weeks, and Thomas knows this, and your husband knows Thomas knows this, but everyone pretends this is a legitimate reason for a social call at 8:30 on a Tuesday night." "Very thoughtful," your husband says in a tone that clearly means, "I'm watching you like a hawk watches a mouse. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Courtship in rural pre-industrial households was a weirdly public affair conducted under constant supervision. Young people had almost no opportunity for private conversation, let alone physical contact. Every interaction happened in the main living space, surrounded by family members who were ostensibly focused on their own tasks, but were actually monitoring every word, glance, and suspicious hand movement. The concept of dating as modern people understand it, 2 people going somewhere alone together, was virtually impossible and also mildly scandalous. Thomas takes the least comfortable seat available, a wooden stool near the door as far from the fire as possible while still technically being in the room. Your daughter sits on the bench by the hearth, and the physical distance between them is approximately 12 feet, which is close enough to talk but far enough that no one can accuse anyone of impropriety. Your mother-in-law has positioned herself with perfect sight lines to both young people, her knitting needles clicking with what sounds like Morse code for "I'm watching both of you." The conversation starts with the kind of painful small talk that happens when multiple generations are eavesdropping. Thomas asks about your chickens. Your daughter responds with information about egg production that's technically accurate but delivered in a tone that suggests she'd rather be discussing literally anything else. Thomas counters with an observation about the weather. Your daughter agrees that yes, it is indeed cold for December. Absolutely riveting stuff. Your son snickers, earning him a glare from your daughter that could melt iron. Historians still argue whether this enforced public courtship actually prevented inappropriate behaviour or simply made young people more creative about finding loopholes. Some scholars suggest that constant supervision kept everyone honest. Others point to evidence of remarkably high rates of premarital pregnancy, despite, or perhaps because of, all this alleged supervision, suggesting that teenagers throughout history have been excellent at finding dark corners and brief moments of unsupervised time. Here's your absolutely fascinating quirky detail. Some regions practiced bundling, a courtship tradition where a young couple would lie in bed together fully clothed, sometimes with a wooden board placed between them, while the girl's family slept in the same room. The logic was that this allowed couples to talk privately, sort of, while maintaining propriety, allegedly, and conserving heat during winter, definitely. Modern people hear about bundling and assume it was either incredibly innocent or incredibly optimistic about human nature. Historical pregnancy records suggest it was probably more the latter. Thomas eventually works up the courage to actually address your daughter directly, rather than speaking to the room at large. "I finished that wooden box," he says, referencing some conversation they apparently had last week. "The one with the brass hinges. Thought you might like to see it sometime." Your daughter's face does something complicated, trying to look interested but not too interested, pleased but not too pleased, because showing excessive enthusiasm in front of your parents is apparently social death for teenage girls across all historical eras. "That sounds nice," she manages, which is teen speak for, "I desperately want to see this box, but I'm going to play it cool because my entire family's watching this interaction like it's theatre." Your husband clears his throat, the universal father signal for "I'm still here and I have opinions about this relationship." The conversation continues in fits and starts, with long, awkward pauses filled by the fire crackling and your mother-in-law's needles clicking, and everyone trying to pretend they're not listening while obviously listening to every single word. Thomas asks if your daughter enjoyed the sermon last Sunday. Your daughter says yes, though honestly she fell asleep during the part about Leviticus, but she's not admitting that in present company. Thomas mentions he's thinking of apprenticing with the Cooper next spring. Your daughter nods as if barrel making is the most fascinating career path imaginable. This is romance in the age before privacy, stilted conversations in public spaces, coded language, meaningful glances that have to substitute for actual physical contact, and the constant awareness that multiple pairs of eyes are tracking every interaction for signs of impropriety or, worse, genuine affection that might lead to marriage discussions. Your mother-in-law suddenly speaks up. "Thomas, how is your mother's rheumatism?" This is grandmother code for "I'm reminding everyone that I'm paying attention," and also evaluating your family's genetic health issues. Thomas responds politely about his mother's joints, while your daughter shoots your mother-in-law a look that could wither crops. The visit continues for another hour, the maximum socially acceptable duration for a non-family member to occupy space in someone's home during winter evening hours. Thomas and your daughter manage to have something resembling a conversation, though it's so heavily chaperoned and carefully worded that you're genuinely not sure if they're courting or negotiating a business arrangement. Maybe both. Pre-industrial romance was often pretty transactional anyway. Finally, Thomas stands to leave, gathering his coat and hat, making elaborate promises to return next week with more implausible gifts of common household items that definitely aren't excuses to see your daughter. Your daughter walks him to the door, under your husband's watchful gaze, and they exchange what might be meaningful eye contact or might be random blinking. It's honestly hard to tell in the dim firelight. The door closes. Thomas's footsteps crunch away through the snow. Your daughter returns to her seat trying to look casual and failing completely because she's glowing with the kind of barely suppressed emotion that only supervised courtship can produce. "He seems nice," you offer neutrally. "He brought kindling," your husband says skeptically. "We don't need kindling." "Oh, for heaven's sake," your daughter mutters, and returns to her mending with aggressive needle stabs that suggest she's imagining puncturing something other than fabric. Your mother-in-law's needles keep clicking. The fire keeps burning. And somewhere out in the winter darkness, Thomas is probably walking home, thinking about wooden boxes and brass hinges, and whether he'll ever get more than 6 words alone with the girl he's courting in front of her entire judgmental family. Romance in the age of communal living. It's complicated, it's public, and it requires more patience than modern people can possibly imagine. With Thomas gone and the romantic tension dissipated, your husband returns to his preferred evening activity, whittling. He's got a chunk of maple clamped between his knees and a small knife that's been sharpened so many times the blade is noticeably thinner than when he inherited it from his father. Wood shavings are already accumulating at his feet in pale curls, and he's got that focused expression that means he's mentally left the room, even though his body is still sitting here. This is his meditation, his therapy, his escape from a day of heavy labour into an evening of slightly different labour that at least produces something other than exhausted muscles. Tonight he's making a new spoon. The household is perpetually short on spoons because wooden spoons have a depressingly short lifespan. They crack, split, burn, get left too close to the fire, get gnawed by teething children, or simply wear down from repeated use until they're more splinter than utensil. Your husband makes approximately 6 to 8 spoons per winter, and it's still barely enough to keep the kitchen functional. The knife moves in short, controlled strokes, peeling away thin layers of wood with a whisper-soft sound that's oddly soothing. Shave, 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 a rhythm as regular as breathing. He's carving the bowl of the spoon now, hollowing out the depression that will eventually hold soup or porridge or whatever semi-liquid substance defines your meals. This is delicate work that requires actual skill. Too aggressive and you punch through the wood. Too timid and you'll be here until spring making a spoon with the depth of a puddle. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Woodworking was a nearly universal male skill in pre-industrial households. Not fancy carpentry or furniture making, those were specialised trades, but basic carving, whittling, and repair work that every man was expected to master by adolescence. You needed to make handles for tools, repair furniture, create household items, and maintain everything wooden in your life, which was approximately 90% of your possessions. Men who couldn't work wood were viewed with the same suspicion as modern people who can't drive, technically functional humans, but missing a crucial life skill. Your son has pulled out his own project. He's trying to carve a whistle from a piece of willow branch. He's been working on this particular whistle for 3 weeks, and it still doesn't make sound, which is either a testament to his persistence or his complete lack of talent. Possibly both. He's mimicking his father's technique, holding the knife at the same angle, making the same careful strokes, but his cuts are less controlled and more hopeful. Wood shavings fly erratically from his workspace. Steady pressure, your husband murmurs without looking up from his spoon. You're hacking at it. Let the knife do the work. Your son adjusts his grip and immediately cuts too deep, creating a gouge that definitely shouldn't be there. He sighs with the dramatic despair of a teenager who's convinced he'll never master anything ever. The workshop corner of your main room, which is really just a designated spot near the tool chest, contains the accumulated repair backlog of your entire household. A chair with a wobbly leg, a broken axe handle awaiting replacement, a butter churn paddle that's developed a crack, a cabinet door that won't close properly, a spinning wheel with a worn drive band. These items sit in silent judgment, waiting for your husband's attention during the long winter evenings when outdoor work is impossible. Historians still argue whether this constant cycle of maintenance and repair was character-building or soul-crushing. Some scholars romanticize the artisan spirit of pre-industrial households, suggesting that creating and maintaining objects with your own hands produced deep satisfaction. Others point out that never-ending repair work, done by inadequate light after a full day of physical labour, was probably just exhausting and annoying. The truth, as usual, likely varies by person and day, and whether the chair leg breaks for the 3rd time this month. Your husband finishes the rough carving and reaches for his sandstone block, a small, fine-grained stone that he uses to smooth wooden surfaces. He rubs the spoon bowl against the stone in circular motions, the rasping sound joining the fire's crackling and your mother-in-law's knitting needles in the symphony of evening noises. Smooth, smooth, smooth. The wood goes from rough carved to slightly less rough, which counts as progress. Here's your wonderfully specific, quirky detail. Some men carved secret marks or initials into the handles of tools and utensils they made, not for identification purposes, but as a form of signature, proof that they'd created this object. Archaeologists regularly find spoons, tools, and wooden items with tiny carved initials or symbols hidden on the underside where they wouldn't be noticed during normal use. It's like pre-industrial tagging, leaving your mark on the world one wooden spoon at a time. Your son's whistle attempt has reached the stage where he's trying to test it, blowing into the mouthpiece and producing absolutely no sound whatsoever. Not even a wheeze, just the pathetic rush of air passing through a tube of wood that refuses to function as a musical instrument. "Did you carve the fipple?" your husband asks. Your son stares blankly. "The what?" "The fipple? The thing. The air-splitting edge, inside the mouthpiece." Your husband sets down his spoon and reaches for the failed whistle. "See? Here. You need to carve a channel that directs air across a sharp edge. That's what makes the sound. You've just carved a hollow stick." This is how skills transfer in pre-industrial households, through demonstration, correction, and the gradual accumulation of techniques that someone will eventually write down in the 20th century and call traditional crafts. Your son watches his father carve the mysterious fipple, which does indeed look like a small channel with a sharp edge, and you can see the understanding dawn in his eyes. Oh, that's how it works. The knife work continues. Your husband returns to his spoon, now working on the handle, thinning it to a comfortable grip width. Your son attempts the fipple carving with renewed hope and marginally better technique. The wood shavings accumulate. The fire burns down and gets fed another log. The evening slides forward in its predictable rhythm of small tasks and smaller conversations. Your husband examines a crack in the butter churn paddle, hairline fracture running along the grain, probably from the wood drying out too much near the fire. He's debating whether to carve a new paddle or attempt to repair with wooden pegs and hope. Carving a new paddle means 3 evenings of work. Repair means it'll probably break again within a month. This is the eternal maintenance dilemma. Invest time in proper replacement or waste time on temporary fixes that'll need refixing. He opts for repair because optimism is cheaper than labour. Your son blows into his whistle and produces an actual sound. Shrill, unsteady, but definitely a sound. His face lights up with shocked delight. Your daughter winces at the piercing note. Your mother-in-law doesn't even look up from her knitting, but you see her smile. "Now make it do that consistently," your husband says, already deflating the achievement, but his tone is warm, proud even. The whittling continues, the maintenance continues, the winter night continues, and slowly, shaving by shaving, stroke by careful stroke, broken things become fixed things. Raw wood becomes useful objects, and the long hours of darkness become slightly more bearable through the simple act of making something with your hands, even if it's just another spoon. You always need another spoon. The woodworking session winds down when your husband's hands start cramping, a nightly occurrence that he refuses to acknowledge as age catching up with him. He sets aside his partially finished spoon and stretches his fingers, and that's apparently the signal your mother-in-law has been waiting for. She sets down her knitting with ceremonial finality, adjusts her shawl, and settles deeper into her chair with the posture of someone preparing to hold court. "Did I ever tell you," she begins, which is how all her stories start, even the ones she's told 47 times, "about the winter when the river froze so solid you could drive a wagon across it? You have heard this story multiple times. But you also know that interrupting her would be rude, and also that her stories are genuinely one of the best entertainment options available. So you make encouraging noises and prepare to hear about the legendary winter of 1748 again. Your mother-in-law is 73 years old, which makes her a walking encyclopedia of local history, family, genealogy, weather patterns, folk remedies, survival techniques, and grudges that date back 50 years. She's lived through wars, famines, epidemics, and approximately 65 winters that range from unpleasant to biblically catastrophic. The knowledge stored in her aging brain represents decades of accumulated experience that hasn't been written down anywhere, because writing things down wasn't really an option for poor farm families who could barely afford paper. She is, essentially, your family's library, and libraries need to be consulted regularly or the information gets lost. Here's your mainstream historical fact that modern people really need to understand. Oral history wasn't a quaint tradition in pre-industrial societies. It was the primary method of information transfer. Everything from property boundaries to family relationships to medical knowledge to agricultural techniques lived in people's memories and got passed down through storytelling. When an elder died without sharing their knowledge, entire chunks of family and community history just vanished. This is why old people were treated with a level of respect that seems almost excessive to modern sensibilities. They weren't just your relatives, they were living archives. The winter of 48, your mother-in-law continues, warming to her tale, started normal enough. Cold in November, some snow in December. But then January came, and it was like God himself decided to show us what real winter looked like. Your children have stopped their activities to listen. Even your son, who's heard this story at least 20 times, pays attention because the way she tells it, the dramatic pauses, the specific details, the way her voice drops to a whisper for the scary parts, transforms historical recitation into performance. She describes temperatures so cold that spit froze before hitting the ground, livestock that froze standing up in their stalls, trees that exploded from the cold, making sounds like cannon fire, and yes, the river that froze so solid that people held a market on the ice, with vendors setting up stalls and families treating it like a festival, because if you're going to be trapped in catastrophic winter weather, you might as well make it social. My mother, your mother-in-law says, her voice taking on the reverent tone she uses for her own mother's memory. She saved this family that winter with something her mother taught her. And here's where the story shifts from entertainment to education, because your mother-in-law is about to share actual survival knowledge disguised as family lore. We ran out of proper food by February, had some grain, but not enough, some dried apples, but they were mostly rot. Father was ready to slaughter the milk cow, which would have meant no milk come spring, no calves, no future. But Mother remembered something her mother learned from the Swedish families who settled upriver. She pauses for effect. Your daughter is leaning forward, and you realise this is a version of the story you haven't heard before. Your mother-in-law is doing that thing where she reveals new information years later, parceling out family history like she's got a limited supply and needs to ration it carefully. Pine needle tea, your mother-in-law announces triumphantly. Sounds mad, doesn't it? Eating tree needles, but Mother boiled pine needles, young ones, green ones, and made a tea that kept us from getting the scurvy that killed half the settlement. Tasted like turpentine mixed with bitterness, but it kept us alive. Historians still argue whether folk remedies like pine needle tea were based on genuine nutritional knowledge or lucky accidents that got preserved through tradition. Pine needles do contain vitamin C, and scurvy prevention would have been crucial during extended winters, but whether pre-industrial people understood the mechanism or just knew this thing works remains debated. The practical result is the same either way. Knowledge preserved through oral tradition saved lives. Your son asks the obvious question, how did the Swedish families know about pine needles? Your mother-in-law shrugs. Their grandmothers told them, and their grandmothers learned from someone else. Maybe the native people who lived here first. Maybe they figured it out themselves. The knowing is what matters, not the origin story. Here's your delightfully specific, quirky detail. Some families maintained recipe books that were entirely oral, complex cooking instructions, preserving techniques, and medicinal preparations passed down through generations without ever being written. Anthropologists have documented cases where elderly women could recite preparation instructions for 50 or more different remedies, including precise measurements, timing, and preparation methods, all from memory. These walking cookbooks would gather apprentice family members during winter evenings and drill them on the recipes until they had them memorized perfectly. Your mother-in-law shifts topics to family genealogy, another crucial function of elder storytelling. She's tracing your husband's family line, connecting him to relatives he's never met, some of whom have been dead for 50 years. Your grandfather's sister married the miller's son from downriver. They had 4 children, 3 lived, 1 died of fever. The oldest daughter, Sarah, married a merchant and moved to the city. Never came back, not even when her mother died. The middle son, William, took over the mill and ran it for 40 years. This might sound like idle gossip, but it's actually vital social mapping. In a world without written records, knowing your extended family connections determined everything from property inheritance to marriage arrangements to who might help you during a crisis. Your mother-in-law is maintaining the family tree in real time, updating connections, noting births and deaths, ensuring that the network of relationships stays clear and accessible. Your daughter asks about your mother-in-law's mother. your children's great-great-grandmother, and suddenly the story shifts into deeper territory. Tales of the old country, the reasons for immigration, the journey across the ocean that killed 2 of the 7 children who started the voyage. Your mother-in-law's voice gets quieter here, more personal, because these aren't entertaining stories. These are grief narratives that need to be remembered precisely because they're painful. "We forget too easily," your mother-in-law says, looking directly at your children. "You'll grow up and have children of your own, and if no one tells you these stories, you'll lose them. You'll lose where you came from, who your people were, what they survived." It's heavier than your usual evening entertainment, but it's also necessary. This is how identity gets maintained across generations, through deliberate acts of remembering, performed over and over in firelit rooms during winter nights, when there's nowhere to go and nothing to do except listen to the old woman talk about people who died before you were born. Your mother-in-law launches into a local legend next, the ghost that supposedly haunts the crossroads near the old mill, a woman in white who appears before disasters. Your son is immediately riveted. Your daughter pretends to be skeptical, but is clearly listening intently. The story has everything: mysterious deaths, unexplained phenomena, warnings ignored, and tragic consequences. It's probably embellished beyond recognition from whatever actually happened. But the core truth, that something happened at that crossroads and people died, is preserved in the supernatural coating. The evening wears on. Your mother-in-law's voice continues, weaving between family history, survival techniques, local lore, and stories whose main function is simply to pass time and maintain connections between generations. Her memory is vast, detailed, and, you're increasingly aware, irreplaceable. When she dies, all of this goes with her unless someone else learns it, stores it, passes it forward. So you listen. Your children listen. And somewhere in the darkness, the chain of memory adds another link, fragile but persistent, connecting the past to the future through stories told by firelight on long winter nights. Your mother-in-law's storytelling session naturally winds toward the upcoming Christmas season, and suddenly, everyone's mood shifts from reflective to slightly manic. Because here's the thing about endless winter darkness. You need something to look forward to, some break in the monotony, or you'll lose your mind somewhere around February. Midwinter festivals, Christmas, Twelfth Night, whatever your particular tradition celebrates, aren't just religious observances. They're psychological survival mechanisms disguised as holy days. Your daughter jumps on the topic immediately. "Can we do the Mummers Play this year, please? The Johnsons are doing one, and if we don't, everyone will think we're boring." Ah yes, the Mummers Play, a beloved folk tradition where your family and neighbours dress in ridiculous costumes, perform a chaotic drama about St. George fighting a dragon, or possibly a Turkish knight depending on which version got garbled down through the generations, and generally make fools of yourselves for community entertainment. It's terrible theatre, but it's your terrible theatre, and the planning starts now, 6 weeks before the actual performance. Your husband looks pained. He's still recovering from last year's Mummers Play, where he played the dragon and had to wear a costume made from burlap sacks stuffed with straw, which gave him a rash that lasted until March. But your daughter's eyes are doing that pleading thing that daughters throughout history have weaponized against fathers, so his resistance crumbles in approximately 4 seconds. "Fine," he sighs, "but I'm not being the dragon again." Here's your mainstream historical fact. Midwinter festival preparation in pre-industrial households typically began 6 to 8 weeks before the actual celebration, and involved the entire community in coordinated planning. This wasn't spontaneous festivity. This was carefully orchestrated cultural production that required costume creation, food preservation, song memorization, and complex social coordination. The preparation was often more important than the festival itself because it gave people something productive to focus on during the darkest, most depressing part of winter. Your mother-in-law pulls out her festival box, a wooden chest containing remnants of past celebrations, old ribbons that are more stain than ribbon, scraps of coloured cloth that might work for costume pieces, a mask made from paper, and paint that somehow survived 5 years despite looking like it would disintegrate if you breathed on it wrong. Half a jester's hat, some bells that lost their clappers. This is your theatrical supplies budget. Whatever didn't get destroyed last time, plus whatever you can scrounge from neighbours and improvise from household materials. We need to decide on roles, you announce, taking charge before this devolves into argument. The play needs St. George, the Turkish knight, the doctor, the fool, and the dragon. I'll be the fool, your son volunteers immediately, which is either perfect casting or an admission of self-awareness that you're not ready to examine closely. Your daughter wants to be St. George, which is technically a male role, but you're farm people putting on a living room performance, not Broadway, so gender accuracy seems less important than enthusiasm. Your husband reluctantly accepts the Turkish knight role, which requires less costume construction than the dragon. You're stuck being the doctor, and your mother-in-law will handle narration and possibly play a tree if the script requires it. The costume planning begins immediately. St. George needs armour, or at least something that looks vaguely metallic and protective. Your daughter suggests using old pots and pans tied together, which is creative but would make movement impossible and create a noise level that would wake the dead. You compromise on a tunic decorated with buttons and some strategic stitching that might look like chainmail if everyone squints, and the lighting stays terrible. Historians still argue whether these folk performances were genuine cultural expressions or just desperate attempts to break the monotony of winter isolation. Some scholars see deep pagan symbolism and community bonding in Mummer's traditions. Others point out that people were bored out of their minds and would have performed Shakespeare in pig costumes if it meant doing something different for an evening. Probably both perspectives have merit. Here's your delightfully weird, quirky detail. Some communities took their Mummers' plays so seriously that they developed rival troupes who competed for performance quality, audience size, and bragging rights. There are documented cases of Mummers' feuds that lasted generations, with families refusing to speak to each other because great-grandpa once stole the dragon costume during a performance dispute in 1723. Rural entertainment was apparently very intense. The food planning starts next because festivals require special food, or they're just regular days with costumes. You've been saving ingredients since autumn specifically for Christmas. A small amount of sugar, some dried fruit, spices that cost actual money, and the good flour that doesn't taste like sawdust mixed with despair. These will become Christmas cakes, special breads, and treats that you'll eat exactly once per year because the ingredients are too expensive for regular consumption. Your mother-in-law has strong opinions about the Christmas cake recipe. My mother always added extra nutmeg, she insists, which becomes an annual debate because your mother's recipe used different spice ratios, and combining the two family traditions has created a holiday Cold War that's been running for 15 years. We could make 2 cakes, your daughter suggests diplomatically. We could, you agree, if we had infinite butter and twice the sugar budget. We do not. The compromise will involve making 1 cake with a spice blend that satisfies no one but offends no one, which is basically how all family decisions get made anyway. Your son wants to know if you're making the special Christmas ale, the strong spiced brew that adults drink during the festival period and that he's been trying to sneak taste of since he turned 11. The answer is yes. You've been brewing it since October. And no, he still can't have any, and yes, you know he's going to sneak some anyway, but you're maintaining plausible deniability. The decoration planning begins. Pine branches to bring inside for their scent and greenery, holly if you can find, any that hasn't been picked clean by neighbours. Candles. You'll splurge on real wax candles for Christmas Eve instead of the usual tallow stubs, because if you can't have nice things once a year, what's even the point of surviving winter? We should make paper chains, your daughter suggests, which requires paper you don't have and time you barely have. But the enthusiasm in her voice suggests this is non-negotiable. So paper chains it is, constructed from whatever scraps you can scavenge and glued together with flour paste. Because pre-industrial craft projects were all about creative poverty. The anticipation is building already. You can feel it in the room. Everyone's energy is lifted. Conversations are more animated. Even the endless textile work seems less tedious when you're discussing costume construction, instead of just maintaining existing clothes. This is the magic of having something to look forward to. The festival is still 6 weeks away, but the planning, the preparing, the imagining, that starts now and carries you through the darkest weeks. Your husband is already sketching costume ideas with a burnt stick on a scrap of wood. The Turkish knight needs a turban, apparently, which means wrapping cloth around his head in a way that looks exotic and foreign, without actually resembling anything Turkish people have ever worn. Historical accuracy is not the goal here. The goal is different enough from everyday clothes that it registers as costume. The evening continues with increasingly elaborate festival plans. Someone suggests inviting the neighbours for a feast. Someone else points out that feeding 12 extra people requires resources you don't have. The compromise is a smaller gathering with shared dishes, where everyone brings something and you pray it's enough. And somewhere in all this planning, the winter night feels less oppressive. The darkness is still there, still pressing against the windows, still waiting outside the door. But inside you're building towards something, creating, imagining, transforming the endless monotony into something worth surviving for. Even if it's just a terrible play performed in homemade costumes, followed by overpriced cake and watered-down ale. Sometimes that's enough. The festival planning finally exhausts itself around 10 o'clock, when even your daughter's enthusiasm can't generate another costume idea or food suggestion. Your mother-in-law is yawning, her jaw cracking, no attempt to hide it yawns that signal she's done with consciousness for the evening. Your husband banks the fire, reducing it to coals that will hopefully stay alive until morning, and everyone begins the migration towards sleeping spaces. But here's where pre-industrial life gets weird in a way that modern people really struggle to understand. You're not going to bed to sleep for 8 straight hours. That's not how sleep worked before electric light rewired human circadian rhythms. You're going to bed for first sleep, a solid 4-hour chunk of unconsciousness that will end around 2 in the morning, at which point you'll wake up naturally, be fully alert for 1 to 2 hours, and then return to bed for second sleep until dawn. This isn't insomnia. This isn't a sleep disorder. This is just how humans slept for thousands of years. You settle into your bed, a wooden frame with a straw mattress that's been compressed into a lumpy approximation of comfort, covered with every quilt and blanket you own because the room temperature is currently somewhere around 40 degrees. Your husband is already generating heat like a personal furnace, which is honestly his most valuable winter quality. The children are in their shared bed across the room, burrowing under their pile of covers until only the tops of their heads are visible. Your mother-in-law has her own small bed near the fire's remaining warmth, wrapped so thoroughly in blankets she looks like a cloth cocoon. The house settles into darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, actual, complete, absolute darkness. The kind of dark where you genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face. The kind of dark that modern people experience maybe once in their entire lives, if they're lucky enough to be somewhere without light pollution. This is the default setting for human nighttime, and it's profoundly, weirdly disorienting if you're not used to it. Here's your mainstream historical fact that deserves more attention. Historical references to first sleep and second sleep appear throughout pre-industrial literature, legal documents, prayer books, and medical texts. People casually mentioned waking between sleeps like it was the most normal thing in the world, because it was. Prayer manuals included specific prayers for the hours between sleeps. Court depositions referenced events happening during the first sleep or after first sleep. Doctors gave different medical advice for treatments taken before first sleep versus between sleeps. This wasn't a quirk of a few individuals. This was the standard human sleep pattern before artificial lighting. You drift off quickly. Physical exhaustion makes falling asleep easy, and enter the deep, dreamless sleep that comes from spending all day, doing actual physical labor instead of sitting at a desk pretending to be busy. 4 hours pass in what feels like minutes, and then, right around 2 in the morning, your eyes open. You're awake. Completely, unambiguously awake. Not groggy, not fighting to stay asleep, just awake, like your brain flipped a switch and decided sleep time is temporarily suspended. This is the watch period, the interval between sleeps, and your body has been doing this every night for your entire life, so it feels entirely natural. Next to you, your husband is also awake. You can tell by his breathing pattern and the fact that he just shifted position deliberately, instead of the unconscious movements of sleep. Neither of you speaks immediately. There's something peaceful about lying in absolute darkness, warm under the blankets, not required to do anything or be anywhere. Historians still argue about what caused this biphasic sleep pattern and why it disappeared with industrialization. Some researchers believe it's humanity's natural sleep rhythm, suppressed by modern lighting that extends our active hours artificially. Others suggest it was an adaptation to long winter nights. Sleeping in 2 shifts made the darkness more manageable. Still others point to safety concerns. Waking midnight allowed people to check for fires, predators, or intruders. The truth probably involves all of these factors plus a dozen others that we'll never fully understand. But whatever caused it, here you are, wide awake at 2 in the morning, with zero interest in going back to sleep for at least an hour. Your husband sits up first, carefully to avoid letting cold air under the blankets. You hear him fumbling in the darkness for the chamber pot. One of the primary reasons people woke between sleeps was bladder management, which is decidedly unromantic but entirely practical. Pre-industrial people typically drank their main liquid intake during the day, which meant that 4 hours into sleep, biological necessity demanded attention. You follow suit, navigating the pitch-black room by memory and touch. You've lived here long enough that you can map every piece of furniture, every floor plank that creaks, every obstacle that might trip you in the dark. Your feet know this path automatically. 3 steps from the bed, slight angle left to avoid the trunk, 2 more steps to the corner where the pot lives. Here's your wonderfully specific quirky detail. Some wealthy households employed gong farmers, the unfortunately named professionals who collected night soil, but they typically only came weekly or monthly. This meant that by the end of the collection period, chamber pots in bedrooms became potent. Historical accounts describe people stuffing rags around pot lids and placing them as far from sleeping areas as possible. Some families designated specific overnight guests as pot duty, meaning they got stuck with the bedroom that housed the fullest chamber pot. Hospitality has always been complicated. Your husband has moved to the fire, stirring the coals and adding small pieces of kindling to create a brief flame, not enough to heat the room properly, but enough to provide a few minutes of light. This is an acceptable use of fuel during the between sleeps period, partially because humans are drawn to fire like moths, and partially because sometimes you need to actually see where you're going. In the brief firelight, you can see your mother-in-law is also awake, sitting up in her bed, her hands moving through her rosary beads again. Between sleeps prayers were a major part of pre-industrial spiritual life, special devotions designed specifically for these midnight hours. Some prayer books describe this time as particularly holy, when the soul was most receptive to divine communication. Or maybe it was just something to do with your hands while you waited for sleepiness to return. Your children, notably, are still completely unconscious. Young children typically slept straight through the night in single blocks, which is why parents throughout history have resented their offspring's ability to sleep peacefully, while adults lie awake in the dark. Your son is snoring softly, that wet, congested sound that suggests he's developing a cold. Your daughter is completely invisible under her blankets, but you can see the pile rising and falling with her breath. You settle near the fire's warmth, not close enough to get truly warm, but close enough that you can see your husband's face in the flickering light. This is the strange intimacy of between sleeps hours, sitting together in near darkness, not quite awake enough for full conversation, but not tired enough to sleep. Some couples use this time for sex, which medieval medical texts actually recommended as healthier during the watch period than immediately before sleep. Some people used it for solitary prayer or meditation. Some just sat and thought, letting their minds wander through whatever topic seemed important at 2 in the morning. Your husband mentions that he heard something outside earlier, probably just wind or a branch falling, but in the darkness every sound becomes potentially significant. This is another reason for the watch period. It allowed people to verify that strange noises were harmless, that the livestock were secure, that the house wasn't on fire. A quick check during the natural wake period was safer than ignoring concerns or losing sleep worrying. The fire burns down to coals again. Your eyelids are starting to feel heavy, the signal that second sleep is approaching. Your mother-in-law has already lain back down, her prayers complete. Your husband yawns, and you feel your own yawn building in response. You return to bed, burrowing back into the warmth that your body heat maintained during your absence. Your husband follows, and within minutes, you're both sliding back into sleep. Second sleep, which will carry you through until dawn, whenever dawn decides to arrive in this godforsaken winter darkness. And tomorrow night, you'll do it all again. First sleep, watch period, second sleep. The rhythm of pre-industrial life, governed by darkness and biology, rather than alarm clocks and schedules. Your body knows this pattern in its bones. This is how humans were designed to sleep, back before electricity convinced us that 8 straight hours was natural. The darkness settles, second sleep begins, the long night continues. Not every watch period is as peaceful as tonight's. Sometimes, more often than you'd like, the waking hours between sleeps become inadvertently productive. because your brain decides that 2 in the morning is the perfect time to remember all the tasks you forgot during actual working hours. Last week you woke between sleeps and suddenly recalled that you'd left the butter churn paddle outside, where it was currently freezing solid and probably cracking along the grain. So you spent 20 minutes stumbling around in the pitch dark, wrapped in a blanket, retrieving the paddle and berating yourself for your forgetfulness. Your husband woke and assumed you were having some kind of medical emergency, which led to a whispered argument about whether frozen butter paddles constituted a legitimate crisis. You maintained that yes, they absolutely did, because replacing that paddle would cost 3 evenings of carving. He remains unconvinced. Tonight, during your watch period, your mind decides to fixate on the chicken coop. Did you properly secure the door? You remember closing it, but did you drop the latch? Because last month something, probably a fox, possibly a demon, got into the coop and massacred 3 hens, and you cannot afford another loss like that. The doubt gnaws at you until you're fully awake again, the sleepiness that was approaching completely dispelled by anxiety about poultry security. Your husband is already back asleep. Men seem to transition between sleeps faster, or maybe he's just better at ignoring intrusive thoughts about chicken safety. You lie there for approximately 4 minutes trying to convince yourself that the coop is fine, you're being paranoid, go back to sleep. It doesn't work. The only cure for middle-of-the-night anxiety is checking the thing you're anxious about, so you haul yourself out of bed again, wrap up in layers of clothes that make you look like a fabric monster, and grab the small oil lamp that you keep for genuine emergencies. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Nighttime livestock checks were incredibly common during watch periods, especially in winter when predators were desperate and animals were vulnerable. Account books and diaries frequently mention went to check the barn between sleeps as a routine occurrence rather than unusual behaviour. This wasn't paranoia. This was practical animal husbandry in an era when losing even one animal could mean the difference between adequacy and starvation. The lamp provides minimal light as you navigate out of the house, just enough to avoid tripping over furniture but not enough to actually see clearly. The night outside is profoundly dark and profoundly cold. Your breath creates clouds of vapour that the lamplight catches, making you look like a small dragon exhaling smoke. The snow crunches under your boots with that particular squeaking sound that only happens in extremely cold temperatures, probably somewhere around 10 degrees. The chicken coop is maybe 50 feet from your house, which feels like 50 miles in the darkness. Every shadow is a potential threat. Every sound, and there are surprisingly many sounds in the supposedly silent night, makes you flinch. Something rustles in the woods beyond your property. Probably a deer, possibly a bear, maybe just wind in the underbrush. The lamp doesn't throw light far enough for you to tell. You reach the coop and yes, thank God the latch is secure. You lift it anyway, peer inside with your weak lamplight, count chickens by their dim shapes on the roosts. 6, 7, 8, all present, all apparently alive, all judging you for disturbing them at 2 in the morning. One hen makes a disapproving cluck that sounds remarkably human in its contempt. Crisis averted, paranoia satisfied. You can return to bed now. Except now you're thinking about the root cellar. Did you close it properly after retrieving turnips yesterday? Because if you left it open, the stored vegetables will freeze, and that's basically your winter food supply converted into expensive compost. So now you're trudging to the cellar, lamp held high, checking on root vegetables like some kind of deranged midnight gardener. Historians still argue whether this kind of middle-of-the-night productivity was psychologically healthy, or a symptom of the constant low-grade anxiety that characterized pre-industrial life. Some scholars suggest that using watch periods for light work helped people feel productive and reduced nighttime anxiety. Others point out that never truly resting, always being partially vigilant, probably contributed to chronic stress and exhaustion. Both are probably true simultaneously. Here's your delightfully specific quirky detail. Some rural households maintained night books, informal logs where people recorded what they did during watch periods. These records reveal fascinating patterns. Women typically use the time for prayer, contemplation, or light handwork like knitting. Men more often checked animals, property, or did repair calculations. Children, when they woke, were usually redirected back to sleep immediately. Some entries are mundane: checked the cow, found her well. Others are startlingly intimate: spoke with wife about her mother's illness, both wept. A few are just bizarre: Spent watch period trying to remember the name of father's brother's wife's sister. Still cannot recall it. You return to the house, cold and slightly damp from snow, but satisfied that everything is secure. Your husband hasn't stirred. Your mother-in-law is awake again, though. You can hear her moving around in the darkness, probably heading to her own chamber pot for the second or third time tonight. Elderly bladders keep their own schedules. You're debating whether to try sleeping again, or just accept wakefulness when you hear your daughter's voice from across the room, soft and uncertain. "Mama, are you awake?" This is unusual. Your daughter typically sleeps straight through, adolescent unconsciousness being notoriously difficult to interrupt. "I'm awake," you whisper back. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I just woke up, and I've been lying here thinking about everything, and I can't make my brain stop." Welcome to the watch period, child. This is what happens when your natural sleep cycle intersects with an overactive mind and too many responsibilities. You navigate across the dark room by memory, settle on the edge of her bed. What are you thinking about? Everything. The mummers play. Whether Thomas actually likes me or just pretends. How many eggs we'll get tomorrow. If there's going to be another war. Whether I'll ever learn to spin as fast as grandmother. Just everything all at once. This is remarkably familiar. The watch period has a way of turning your brain into an anxiety-producing machine, cycling through every concern, worry, and random thought with equal intensity. During the day, you can distract yourself with work. During the watch period, in darkness and silence, your mind just spins and spins. Try counting your breaths, you suggest, which is the advice your mother gave you and her mother gave her, going back probably to whoever first noticed that focusing on breathing sometimes interrupts the anxiety spiral. In through your nose, out through your mouth, count to 10, then start over. You sit with her for a few minutes, your presence apparently enough to calm whatever mental storm was brewing. Her breathing steadies. She shifts into a more comfortable position. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" You will, even though your own second sleep is calling, because this is what mothers do during watch periods. They sit in the dark with their children, providing the wordless comfort of proximity, the reassurance that someone else is awake and watching and keeping the darkness at bay. Eventually her breathing deepens into actual sleep. You return to your own bed, carefully, quietly. Your husband makes a questioning sound, half awake, checking if you're okay. You make a reassuring sound back. Marriage in the darkness is its own language of small noises and unspoken understanding. Second sleep comes slowly this time, your brain still half engaged with the list of concerns your daughter articulated. But eventually, thankfully, sleep wins. The darkness remains, but consciousness fades, and the long night continues its slow progression toward morning. Tomorrow night, you'll wake again, check different things, worry about different problems, navigate the same darkness with slightly different concerns. This is the rhythm of winter nights. Wake, check, worry, pray, think, sleep. Repeat until spring. Not all watch period awakenings are about productive livestock checks or anxious midnight chores. Sometimes you wake between sleeps because your brain has conjured something horrifying from the depths of your subconscious. And now you're lying in absolute darkness, trying to convince yourself that the nightmare wasn't a premonition of actual doom. Your son wakes screaming around 3 a.m, a genuine terror-filled scream that launches everyone into panicked consciousness. Your husband is on his feet before his brain catches up with his body, ready to fight whatever threat has invaded. Your mother-in-law is praying urgently in Latin, which is her default response to all crises. You're stumbling toward your son's bed, heart hammering, trying to figure out if this is a medical emergency or something worse. "The man," your son gasps, still half in the nightmare. "The man with no face was standing by the door watching us sleep." Ah, just a nightmare then. Though the "just" does a lot of work in that sentence, because nightmares in pre-industrial darkness weren't like modern bad dreams you could shake off by turning on a lamp and checking social media. These were vivid, terrifying experiences that happened in the same pitch-black environment where real dangers existed, and your brain had no easy way to distinguish between dream threats and actual threats. You gather your son close. He's too old to really want this kind of comfort, but terror overrides adolescent dignity. "It was a dream," you murmur, the universal parent reassurance that's probably been spoken in every language since humans developed speech. "Just a dream. Nothing's here." But here's the thing. You're not entirely sure you believe that yourself, because pre-industrial darkness wasn't just dark. It was spiritually threatening in ways that modern people struggle to understand. The night wasn't simply the absence of light. It was a different realm entirely, where the normal rules suspended and other things walked. Every culture had variations on this theme. Spirits, demons, ghosts, fair folk, night hags, whatever name you gave to the entities that supposedly populated the hours between sunset and sunrise. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Belief in supernatural night dangers wasn't superstition in the sense of silly peasants being ignorant. It was a rational response to a genuinely dangerous environment where people regularly died from things they couldn't see or understand. Disease struck mysteriously in the night. People died in their sleep. Babies stopped breathing. Fires started spontaneously. In the absence of scientific explanations, supernatural attribution made sense. The night was dangerous, therefore dangerous things lived in the night. Your mother-in-law has lit a candle, an expensive gesture that signals genuine concern. In the flickering light, she's retrieving her bag of protective items, a small pouch of salt, a dried rowan branch, a scrap of paper with a protective prayer written on it, and what appears to be a chicken bone tied with red thread. This is her spiritual defense system, accumulated over 7 decades of surviving darkness. She sprinkles salt across the threshold of the sleeping area, while muttering prayers in a mixture of Latin and what might be Gaelic or possibly just nonsense syllables that sound appropriately mystical. Your husband doesn't interfere because questioning your mother-in-law's protective rituals would be like questioning whether locking the door is necessary. Sure, maybe it's not strictly rational, but why take the risk? Historians still argue whether these protective rituals actually provided psychological comfort, or if people performed them out of obligation while remaining skeptical. Personal letters from the era show a fascinating mix. Some people describe genuine belief in spirits and protective magic, while others suggest they're just following traditions to avoid social judgment. Probably, as usual, both types existed in the same household. Believers and skeptics performing the same rituals for different reasons. Your son has calmed down enough to describe the nightmare in detail. The faceless man appeared in the corner, moved closer without walking, reached toward him with hands that weren't quite hands. Classic nightmare imagery that probably reflects some combination of anxiety, poor digestion, and the human brain's tendency to populate darkness with threats. But your mother-in-law takes it seriously. Facing man dreams are warnings, she announces, with the authority of someone who's been interpreting dreams since before you were born. Something is coming. A change. Possibly death. Possibly just hardship. Or possibly he ate too much pork at dinner, your husband suggests, trying to inject rationality into supernatural interpretation, but he's clearly outnumbered by the women in this household who've decided this dream means something. Here's your wonderfully specific, quirky detail. Dream interpretation books circulated widely in pre-industrial communities, and some were amazingly specific. Dreaming of teeth falling out meant death in the family. Dreaming of water meant emotional turmoil. Dreaming of bread meant prosperity. Dreaming of a cat meant betrayal. These interpretations were taken seriously enough that people would alter their behavior based on dreams, cancelling travel, making peace with enemies, or preparing for disasters based on what they'd seen while unconscious. Your daughter wants to know what it means when you dream about flying, which suggests she's been having significantly better nighttime experiences than her brother. Your mother-in-law considers this. Flying dreams mean ambition beyond your station, she declares, which seems pointed given your daughter's recent interest in the blacksmith's son who's technically a step above your family's social position. The conversation has shifted from immediate terror to general dream discussion, which is honestly a relief because it means everyone's calming down. Your husband describes a recurring dream he has about losing all his teeth, which according to your mother-in-law's system means he's worried about providing for the family. Your husband protests that he's not worried, he's perfectly capable of providing. But his defensiveness suggests maybe the dream interpretation hit closer to truth than he'd like to admit. You mention a dream you had last week about being chased through endless hallways, and your mother-in-law nods knowingly. Running dreams mean avoidance. You're fleeing responsibility or truth. Or maybe I'm just tired and my brain is processing stress through nonsense imagery, you suggest. Same thing, your mother-in-law says, and honestly she might have a point. The candle burns down to a stub. Your son has fully calmed. though he's clearly not eager to return to sleep immediately in case the faceless man is waiting in his subconscious. Your mother-in-law suggests leaving the rowan branch under his pillow for protection, and he accepts it with a mixture of skepticism and genuine relief. Because here's the truth about protective rituals. They work whether you believe in the magic or just believe in the comfort of tradition. The household settles back into sleeping positions. The candle gets blown out, returning everyone to darkness. But this time, the darkness feels slightly less threatening because it's been acknowledged, discussed, defended against, with salt and prayer and dried plants that may or may not have magical properties. Your son's breathing evens out into sleep. Your daughter follows shortly after. Your mother-in-law mutters a final protective prayer, St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, protect us from wickedness and snares of the devil, and so on. The darkness remains. The spirits, real or imagined, continue their activities or don't, depending on whether you're asking a believer or a skeptic. But everyone feels slightly safer, because you've done the things humans have done for thousands of years. Name the fear, perform the rituals, invoke the protections, and convinced yourselves that you have some control over the uncontrollable darkness. Second sleep comes eventually. Dreams come or don't. The night continues its slow progression toward dawn, and tomorrow night you'll probably do it all again. Morning arrives with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Specifically, the sound of your cow lowing urgently from the attached lean-to that serves as her winter quarters. She's not in distress. She's just announcing that her udder is uncomfortably full, and would someone please address this situation immediately. This is your alarm clock from November through March, a bovine voice echoing through the thin wall that separates your sleeping area from the livestock section. Your husband groans but rises, because ignoring an unmilked cow leads to mastitis, reduced milk production, and a very angry animal who will make everyone's life miserable until her grievance is addressed. He wraps himself in layers and disappears through the internal door that connects your living space to the livestock area, an architectural feature that seems insane to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense when the alternative was going outside in sub-zero temperatures multiple times per day. You can hear him talking to the cow in that gentle, nonsensical voice that farmers use with animals. Yes, yes, I know. You're very uncomfortable. Let's fix that, shall we? The rhythmic sound of milk hitting the wooden bucket follows. Squirt, squirt, squirt. A familiar morning soundtrack that means your household will have fresh milk for porridge and enough left over for butter churning tonight. Here's your mainstream historical fact that horrifies modern people. Sharing living space with livestock was standard practice for the majority of rural households in pre-industrial Europe and colonial America. Not because people loved being surrounded by animals, but because keeping animals alive through winter was literally a matter of survival, and dead animals don't provide milk, wool, or spring offspring. The arrangement was practical, not romantic. Body heat from livestock raised indoor temperatures by several crucial degrees, and having animals immediately accessible meant you could monitor and care for them without risking frostbite every time someone needed milking. Your cow, her name is Bess, not that she cares, occupies roughly 1/3 of your attached structure. The other sections house your 3 sheep, a pig that's being fattened for spring slaughter, and a dozen chickens who've been brought inside from their coop because temperatures dropped low enough that they'd literally freeze to death otherwise. This menagerie produces a symphony of sounds throughout the night. Lowing, bleating, grunting, clucking, and the constant shifting of bodies trying to get comfortable in close quarters. And the smells. Oh, the smells. Modern people who romanticize simpler times have clearly never spent a February night in a one-room dwelling that also houses multiple large mammals and their digestive outputs. The air in here is thick with a rich bouquet of manure, urine, wet animal fur, fermented grain from the feed, and the general musk of creatures who don't bathe and don't care about your olfactory preferences. You're so accustomed to it that you barely notice anymore. It's just the smell of winter, as familiar as wood smoke or your mother-in-law's cooking. But when Thomas visited last night for his awkward courtship session, you could see him trying not to react to the smell. His family has livestock too, obviously, but different animals produce different stenches, and he's not acclimated to your particular combination of cow, sheep, pig, and poultry. Your daughter noticed him flinching and looked mortified, because apparently teenage romance is supposed to happen in rose-scented palaces, rather than buildings that smell like a barn, which they technically are. Historians still argue whether this human-animal cohabitation was unhealthy from a disease transmission standpoint, or actually beneficial because it increased immune system exposure to various pathogens. Some medical historians point to higher rates of respiratory illness in mixed-species dwellings. Others suggest that constant low-level pathogen exposure built stronger immune systems. Medieval medical texts don't help clarify. They simultaneously recommend keeping animals close for warmth and maintaining distance to avoid corrupted airs. Your husband finishes milking and moves on to the morning feeding routine. You can hear him pouring grain for the chickens, who've started clucking urgently the moment they heard movement. Chickens have no concept of patience or gratitude. They just know they're hungry and will scream about it until someone provides sustenance. Your rooster adds his 2 cents with a crow that's technically impressive given the enclosed space, but also unwelcome at 5:30 in the morning. The pig grunts hopefully. Your husband tosses it some kitchen scraps from yesterday, and the sounds of enthusiastic pig eating follow. Wet, snorting, genuinely disgusting noises that somehow became your family's morning routine. Your son makes a gagging sound from his bed, and you can't really blame him. Pig eating sounds are objectively revolting. Here's your delightfully weird, quirky detail. Some households drew chalk lines or hung ropes to separate the human living space from the animal space within the same structure. These barriers were purely symbolic. They didn't block smell, sound, or even the animals themselves if they felt ambitious. But the psychological division mattered. The chalk line announced, "This side is for people, that side is for beasts," which helped maintain some sense of human dignity while literally living in what was essentially a barn with beds. Your mother-in-law is up now, shuffling toward the livestock area with a bucket. She's checking the sheep, who are her particular responsibility and obsession. These 3 ewes represent a significant portion of your family's wealth. They'll produce lambs in spring, provide wool for spinning, and eventually become mutton when their productive years end. She runs her hands over each one, checking for injuries, illness, or parasites that might have appeared overnight. One sheep has a slightly warm ear, which apparently signals something concerning, because your mother-in-law is now muttering about possible fever and discussing herbal remedies with herself. The chickens have finished their grain and are now just wandering around, occasionally pecking at the straw bedding or each other. They've adapted remarkably well to indoor living, though they're clearly confused about the day-night cycle when there's no natural light cues. Last week, the rooster started crowing at 11 o'clock at night, having apparently decided that schedule changes were his prerogative. Your husband threatened to make him soup. The rooster seemed unimpressed. During the watch period last night, that seemed like days ago now, but was actually just a few hours, your husband did his midnight barn check, which involved coming through this internal door with a dim lantern to verify that all animals were alive. None had escaped their designated areas, nothing was actively giving birth, and the building wasn't on fire. These checks happened at least once per night, sometimes more if someone heard suspicious sounds or couldn't sleep anyway and figured they might as well be productive. The paranoia wasn't excessive. Animals died overnight with depressing regularity, sometimes from cold despite being indoors, sometimes from predators who found ways into supposedly secure buildings, sometimes from mysterious ailments that struck without warning. Checking on them meant you had a chance to intervene before a minor problem became a dead animal and a major financial loss. Your husband returns to the human side of the dwelling, carrying the bucket of fresh milk and wearing an expression that suggests one of the animals did something that annoyed him but isn't worth explaining. He sets the milk on the table and announces that the sheep with the warm ear should probably be isolated, which sparks a debate with your mother-in-law about whether isolation is necessary or you're overreacting to normal animal body temperature variation. The cow moos again, this time just conversationally rather than urgently. She's been fed and milked, and is now simply participating in the household's morning routine. Your pig adds a grunt of agreement. The chickens continue their aimless wandering. The rooster eyes everyone suspiciously, as if we're all plotting his demise, which, to be fair, your husband definitely is. This is your household at dawn. Humans and animals mixed together in a space that's too small, too smelly, and too loud, but also somehow keeping everyone alive through another winter. The arrangement isn't pretty, isn't pleasant, and definitely isn't something you'd choose if alternatives existed. But alternatives don't exist. So you share your space with beasts, breathe air that's 80% barn, wake to animal sounds, and accept that this is simply how winter works when survival requires keeping valuable livestock alive, The cow moos one more time as if to say, "You're welcome for the milk." Your husband glares at her. "We know, you're very helpful. Now please be quiet." She's not quiet. Cows are never quiet. By evening, with the livestock fed and the day's work grinding toward completion, your husband retrieves the key to the cellar and announces he's checking on the beer. This is partially legitimate maintenance. Fermentation requires monitoring, and partially an excuse to sample the product under the guise of quality control. You don't object because, honestly, if anyone's earned a drink after managing a day of farm labour plus evening animal management, it's him. The cellar is accessed through a trapdoor in the floor, leading down a ladder into a space that stays consistently cool year-round. Cold enough to slow fermentation in winter, but not so cold that liquids freeze. Down there, in the darkness that requires a candle to navigate, sit your household's liquid assets. 2 barrels of small beer, the weak, everyday drinking stuff. 1 barrel of strong ale, the special occasion brew. 1/2 barrel of hard cider from autumn's apple pressing, and a collection of bottles containing various experimental fermentations that may become wine or may become vinegar. Time will tell. This isn't recreational drinking, though it serves that function too. This is practical household management, because the alternative to alcohol is water, and winter water is a genuine health hazard. Here's your mainstream historical fact that modern people really need to understand. Pre-industrial families consumed alcohol at rates that would horrify modern public health officials. Not because everyone was an alcoholic, but because beer, cider, and weak wine were safer to drink than water from sources that might be contaminated with human and animal waste, parasites, or disease-causing organisms. The fermentation process killed pathogens, and the alcohol content provided additional antibacterial protection. A typical adult might consume 2 to 3 quarts of small beer daily, not enough to cause intoxication, but enough to stay hydrated without risking dysentery. Your husband returns from the cellar carrying a pitcher of small beer and several wooden cups. This is the signal for evening drinking to commence. Not heavy drinking, just the routine consumption that happens while people work and talk and fill the hours until bedtime. He pours cups for the adults and a heavily watered-down version for the children, because even kids drank alcohol regularly. Not because parents were irresponsible, but because, again, the alternative was potentially contaminated water that could kill them. The beer tastes slightly sour, somewhat yeasty, and not particularly good by modern craft beer standards. But it's wet, it's safe, and it contains calories that supplement your limited winter diet. Medieval people didn't drink beer for flavour. They drank it for survival, with the happy side effect that it made them slightly less miserable. Your mother-in-law mentions that the cider needs checking. It's been fermenting since October and should be approaching drinkability. She's the household cider expert, having learned the process from her mother, who learned from her mother, going back through a chain of women who turned autumn's apple surplus into winter's drinking supply. The process is simple but finicky. Press apples, collect juice, let wild yeasts do their work, hope it becomes cider rather than vinegar, bottle it if it's good, or use it for cooking if it's not. Your daughter asks if she can taste the cider, which is code for "I want actual alcohol, not watered-down beer." You hesitate because she's 14, and there's a difference between routine low alcohol consumption and deliberately getting your teenager tipsy. Your mother-in-law settles it by pouring a small cup and announcing that moderate cider consumption builds character and teaches responsibility. You're not sure about the character-building properties of fermented apple juice, but you let it slide because picking this battle seems exhausting. Historians still argue whether the high alcohol consumption in pre-industrial households led to widespread alcoholism, or if constant low-level intake actually prevented problematic drinking patterns. Some scholars point to historical accounts of public drunkenness, domestic violence linked to alcohol, and social problems clearly caused by excessive drinking. Others note that most people consumed alcohol steadily throughout the day rather than binge drinking, which may have prevented the feast or famine pattern that characterizes modern problem drinking. The truth probably involves acknowledging that yes, some people drank destructively, while most people just drank constantly at low levels and somehow functioned. Here's your delightfully weird, quirky detail. Some households maintained brewing books, where they recorded recipes, fermentation times, and detailed notes about which batches succeeded or failed and why. These books sometimes included elaborate pseudoscience about moon phases affecting fermentation, prayers to invoke successful brewing, and family secrets that were supposedly the difference between good beer and swill. Archaeological discoveries of these books reveal that pre-industrial people took their alcohol production very seriously. Some entries are hundreds of words long, discussing minute variations in grain ratios or fermentation temperatures with the intensity of modern wine snobs. Your husband is on his second cup of beer and has started that pleasant loosening that comes with mild alcohol consumption after a hard day. He's slightly more talkative, slightly less concerned about the endless maintenance tasks awaiting attention, slightly more willing to laugh at his own jokes that aren't particularly funny. This is alcohol's genuine social function. It softens the hard edges of exhausting existence and makes communal living marginally more bearable. The evening's work continues with everyone slightly buzzed. Your mother-in-law's knitting needles move with the confidence of someone who's done this drunk countless times and can maintain quality work even with impaired fine motor control. Your husband's whittling becomes slightly more aggressive, bigger cuts, less precision, but nothing dangerous enough to intervene. Your daughter is giggling at things that aren't hilarious, the cider having hit her adolescent system with more force than she anticipated. Your son asks if he can have real beer instead of the watered version, and your husband actually considers it before you shut down that conversation with a look. There are limits to alcohol normalization, and getting your 11-year-old properly drunk seems like it crosses that line. The strong ale in the cellar remains untouched. That's reserved for actual celebrations, visitors, or emergencies that require serious drinking. Opening that barrel for routine evening consumption would be wasteful, and also would leave you without good alcohol when you actually need it. You learned this lesson years ago when you drank through your entire strong ale supply by February and had nothing good to serve when the pastor visited at Easter. The social embarrassment was worse than the hangover. Your mother-in-law announces that next week you need to start another batch of small beer because current supplies are running low. This sparks a calculation session where everyone tries to figure out grain allocation, how much for bread, how much for beer, how much for animal feed, how much to save for spring planting. It's a complex equation with no good answers, just compromises that leave everyone slightly dissatisfied. The beer continues flowing. Not heavily, no one's aiming for intoxication, just maintenance-level consumption that keeps everyone hydrated and slightly happier than they'd be otherwise. Cups get refilled, conversation continues, the fire crackles, and for these few hours the winter darkness feels marginally less oppressive because you're all slightly drunk together. This is the reality of pre-industrial evenings, constant low-level alcohol consumption that was simultaneously practical, social, medicinal, and recreational. You drank to stay safe. You drank to stay warm. You drank to stay sane. And sometimes you drank because the beer was there and the night was long and sobriety just made everything seem worse. Your husband raises his cup in a mock toast to surviving another day. Everyone drinks to that. Because really, what else is there to celebrate when you're halfway through winter and dawn still feels impossibly far away? The beer goes down easy. The night goes down harder, but at least you're facing it together, slightly buzzed, marginally more optimistic about surviving until morning. Tomorrow you'll brew more, and drink more, and survive more, until spring finally arrives and releases you from this cycle of fermentation and consumption. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight the beer is cold, the fire is warm, and the darkness is just slightly less dark when viewed through the bottom of a cup. Your husband suddenly remembers, with the timing of someone who's been avoiding the task for weeks, that he owes his brother a letter. The brother lives 2 days' travel away, which might as well be another continent given that winter travel is dangerous, expensive, and generally inadvisable. So written correspondence becomes the lifeline maintaining family connections, when actually visiting isn't feasible. The problem is that writing a letter in pre-industrial conditions is roughly as simple as performing minor surgery, and about as pleasant. First, you need paper. Actual paper, which costs money and isn't something you keep in abundant supply. Your household owns maybe 20 sheets of writing paper, stored carefully in a wooden box to protect it from moisture, rodents, and your children's creative urges. Each sheet represents real expense, roughly the cost of a dozen eggs or a pound of butter, so you don't waste it on frivolous messages or practice drafts. You write carefully, correctly, and compress as much information as possible into the available space. Your husband retrieves a single sheet from the box, handling it with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. He's already mentally composing the letter, trying to figure out how to fit 2 months of family news, farm updates, financial questions and social pleasantries into one page without resorting to handwriting so small it's illegible. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Letter writing in pre-industrial households was a formal, carefully planned activity that required multiple expensive materials, good lighting, steady hands, and significant time investment. Unlike modern communication where you can fire off a text in seconds, writing a letter could take an entire evening, and the cost of materials meant you didn't do it casually. Letters were precious objects, often read and reread multiple times, shared among multiple family members, and sometimes kept for years as tangible connections to distant relatives. Next comes the writing implement situation. Your husband owns one quill pen, made from a goose feather, carefully cut and shaped, and a small bottle of iron gall ink that's currently slightly frozen, because the room temperature is hovering around 45 degrees. He holds the ink bottle near the fire to warm it back to liquid consistency, which risks either leaving it too cold to flow or getting it too hot and ruining the chemical composition. There's a very narrow temperature window for optimal ink performance, and you're perpetually missing it. The ink itself is homemade, a mixture of iron sulfate, gall nuts from oak trees, and gum arabic that you bought from a travelling merchant last spring. The recipe came from your mother-in-law's recipe book, where it's sandwiched between instructions for making soap and a cure for warts involving stolen bacon. Remember that one from the almanac reading earlier? The ink is brownish-black when wet, will darken to true black over time, and will hopefully last long enough to write this letter before it dries up or moulds over. Your husband settles at the table with his materials arranged like a surgeon preparing for an operation. Paper, quill, ink, a knife for sharpening the quill when it inevitably dulls, a second piece of rough paper for testing ink flow, and a candle positioned for maximum light without risking fire. The room's general firelight isn't sufficient for detailed writing. You need direct, steady illumination, which means burning a candle specifically for this purpose. Another expense that makes letter writing feel like a luxury activity. Historians still argue whether the cost and difficulty of letter writing actually improved communication quality, whether the forced brevity and careful composition resulted in more meaningful correspondence, or whether it simply prevented people from maintaining the kind of regular contact that builds genuine relationships. Some scholars point to beautiful, thoughtful, historical letters as evidence that constraints improved writing. Others note that many preserved letters are formulaic, stiff, and contain very little personal information because people were writing for an audience, knowing letters were often shared publicly. Your husband dips the quill and begins writing. Immediately, the ink blots. He swears quietly, reaches for the knife and scrapes the blot off the paper, creating a thin spot that will be forever visible, but at least won't ruin the whole sheet. This is why people developed elaborate handwriting with careful letter formation, not for aesthetic reasons, but because quill pens are terrible writing instruments that require constant pressure adjustment to avoid either no ink flow or too much ink flow. There's no middle ground. He starts again. Dear brother, I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirits. The opening is formulaic because that's how letters work. You open with health inquiries regardless of whether you actually care about your brother's health. Then you move into family news. Your mother-in-law's rheumatism is improving, the children are well, the harvest was adequate but not exceptional, the cow had an incident with a fence that required repair. He's compressing entire months of experience into single sentences, creating a summary of life that's technically accurate, but feels inadequate for capturing actual lived reality. Here's your wonderfully specific, quirky detail. Some families developed shorthand codes for communicating sensitive information in letters that might be read by others. The tree is blooming early might mean we have financial problems. Uncle visited unexpectedly might mean we had a death in the family. These codes were passed down through families and allowed for private communication in a system where letters were considered semi-public documents. Some codes were sophisticated enough that historians still can't fully decode them, leading to historical letters that contain obvious hidden meanings that remain forever mysterious. Your daughter asks if she can add a note to her cousin, the brother's daughter, roughly her age, someone she hasn't seen in 2 years. Your husband nods and she squeezes in beside him, trying to see the paper in the limited candlelight. She's composing her message mentally before committing to paper, because there's no room for mistakes or casual rambling. Dear Cousin Mary, I hope you're well. The winter has been cold but manageable. I have been learning to spin. She's doing that thing where teenage girls try to sound mature and sophisticated in written communication, even though in person she'd probably just gossip about boys and complain about chores. Letters demand formality that conversation doesn't, creating this weird split between written personality and actual personality. The letter continues growing, both your husband and daughter taking turns with the quill, carefully navigating around each other's text to maximize space usage. The margins get filled. The gaps between lines get smaller. By the time they're done, the page is absolutely packed with text that flows in multiple directions, utilizes every available inch, and probably requires good lighting and patience to read. Your husband signs it with his name and asks if anyone else wants to add anything. Your son declines. He barely knows his uncle and doesn't particularly want to waste energy on correspondence with a virtual stranger. Your mother-in-law adds a brief note about her rheumatism and her prayers for the family. You squeeze in your own greeting, though you've never actually met your husband's brother, and your relationship consists entirely of occasional letters about nothing in particular. Now comes sealing. Your husband retrieves the sealing wax, another expensive item, bought specially because letters without proper seals are considered informal or potentially tampered with. He melts the wax over the candle flame, drips it onto the folded paper, and presses his ring into it to create an identifying seal. The whole process is weirdly ceremonial, transforming a sheet of paper into an official correspondence that carries family identity and social weight. The letter sits on the table, complete and sealed, waiting for the next traveller heading in the right direction. It might be days before someone suitable appears. It might be weeks. The letter will sit patient and silent until opportunity arrives to carry it onward. And when it finally reaches your husband's brother, probably a month from now, possibly longer, he'll open it, read the compressed life updates, and maybe write back with his own, carefully composed page of news. This is how relationships survive winter isolation, through painstaking written exchanges, expensive materials, terrible lighting, and the sheer determination to maintain connections across distances that feel vast, even when they're objectively small. Your husband blows out the candle, conserving what's left. The letter remains on the table, ready for its journey, and somewhere, in another house, another family is probably doing the same thing, writing, sealing, hoping that words on paper can bridge the gaps that winter creates. The fire continues burning. The darkness continues pressing. But at least you've sent a message into the void, a small act of defiance against isolation. The words will travel, eventually, slowly, but they'll travel. Your family's approach to winter nights, huddling around a single hearth, mixing humans and animals, enduring darkness in a cramped space, feels universal until you realize it's actually quite specific to your particular latitude, climate, and cultural tradition. Because humans across the globe face the same basic problem of long winter nights, and they solved it in wildly different ways depending on what winter actually meant in their region. Take your mother-in-law's stories about her childhood in northern regions, areas where winter meant 4 months of serious cold and darkness so profound that the sun barely rose above the horizon for weeks at a time. Those communities didn't do the single family, single room approach. They built communal halls, massive timber structures where multiple families lived together through the worst months, sharing not just space but resources, labour, and the psychological burden of endless darkness. She describes halls that housed 20 to 30 people at once, with a central hearth so large you could roast an entire animal. Multiple families arranged their sleeping spaces along the walls, creating an arrangement that was part military barracks, part commune, part survival strategy. Privacy was non-existent. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. But the communal approach meant shared body heat, shared food preparation, shared entertainment, and shared watchfulness against the threats that winter brought. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Norse and Northern European communal halls weren't just buildings, they were sophisticated social systems that balanced individual family units with collective survival needs. Historical and archaeological evidence shows these halls functioned as production centres, where everyone contributed skills. Some people cooked, others crafted, others maintained weapons and tools, others told stories and preserved oral history. The arrangement was intensely social, but also intensely hierarchical, with clear rules about who sat where, who ate first, and who had authority over disputes. Your mother-in-law's voice takes on a wistful quality when she describes the entertainment in those halls. Not the solitary family activities you're doing tonight, but group performances, multiple musicians playing together, mass singing that could last hours, storytelling competitions where different families tried to outdo each other with increasingly elaborate tales. The communal approach meant that boredom affected everyone simultaneously, so entertainment became a collective responsibility rather than an individual problem. But that system only works in certain climates. Your husband once met a merchant from Mediterranean regions who described winter nights so completely different they barely seem like the same season. In those areas, winter meant rain rather than snow, cold rather than freezing, inconvenience rather than mortal danger. Families didn't seal themselves inside for months. They continued using outdoor spaces, covered courtyards, protected arcades, semi-open rooms that blurred the line between inside and outside. The merchant described evening gatherings in courtyards lit by oil lamps and braziers, where extended families and neighbours would congregate for hours. The mild temperatures meant you didn't need massive indoor hearths or animal body heat for survival. You could actually move around, visit neighbours, maintain social connections without risking death by exposure. Winter evenings became social time rather than survival time, with people circulating between households, sharing food, playing games, conducting business discussions that happened face-to-face rather than by laboriously written correspondence. Historians still argue whether these regional differences in winter strategy shaped broader cultural patterns, whether communal hall living in the north created more egalitarian social structures, or whether Mediterranean courtyard culture encouraged the kind of public discourse that led to democratic traditions. Some scholars see direct lines between architectural responses to climate and fundamental cultural values. Others suggest that's oversimplified correlation, and that many other factors shaped how societies organized themselves. Your daughter asks about other places. How do people in even colder regions survive? Your mother-in-law mentions stories she's heard about Asian approaches, though her information is third-hand at best and possibly corrupted by multiple retellings. Something about heated floors, or heated tables, or some system where families gathered around a single heat source that was built into furniture rather than being a separate fire pit. She's describing kotatsu, though she doesn't know that word. Low tables with heat sources underneath and heavy blankets draped over them, creating warm enclosed spaces where families could work, eat, sleep and socialize while keeping their lower bodies warm. It's a completely different solution to the same problem. Instead of heating entire rooms, expensive, inefficient, you heat small spaces just large enough for human occupation. The approach requires less fuel, creates instant warmth, and allows for the kind of close family interaction that comes from literally being trapped under a blanket together. Here's your delightfully specific, quirky detail. Some cultures developed elaborate social protocols around their specific heating arrangements. In Japanese households with kotatsu, there were rules about who sat where relative to the heat source, how to enter and exit the heated space politely, and what activities were appropriate under the blanket versus outside it. In Norse halls, the position relative to the central fire indicated social status so precisely that historical legal documents sometimes referenced 3-bench distance from the fire as a way to describe someone's social standing. Heat wasn't just survival, it was social, currency. Your son wants to know which system is best, which is exactly the kind of question that has no good answer. The communal hall approach shares resources but sacrifices privacy. The courtyard approach maintains pleasant winters, but only works in mild climates. The kotatsu approach conserves fuel but requires everyone to stay relatively immobile for hours. Your current system, single family, mixed with animals around one hearth, is somewhere in the middle. More privacy than communal halls, more social isolation than courtyards, more mobility than kotatsu, but also more exposed to cold than any of them. What's best depends entirely on what you're optimizing for. Fuel efficiency, social connection, privacy, warmth, entertainment options, or just not dying. Different cultures made different trade-offs based on available resources, climate severity, and social values that developed over centuries of trial and error. Your mother-in-law mentions another approach she's heard about. Southern regions where winter barely exists as a concept, where people's evening routines don't change significantly between seasons because temperatures stay moderate year-round. Those cultures face different challenges, not fighting cold and darkness, but managing heat and insects, protecting food from spoilage rather than freezing, dealing with seasonal rains rather than snow. In those places, winter evenings might involve sitting outside under stars, enjoying cooler temperatures after the day's heat, conducting life in open-air spaces that your northern family would find incomprehensible in December. The concept of being trapped indoors for months would seem bizarre. The idea of housing animals inside your dwelling would be repulsive rather than practical. The entire framework of winter survival would be foreign. It's a reminder that your particular suffering, the cold, the darkness, the isolation, the animal smells, the endless tedious tasks, isn't universal human experience. It's specific to your latitude, your climate, your cultural traditions. Other people in other places are experiencing their own versions of seasonal challenges, developing their own solutions, creating their own traditions around survival and social cohesion. But knowing other approaches exist doesn't make yours easier. You're still here, in this cold room, with this particular fire, these particular animals, this particular family, facing this particular darkness in the way your ancestors faced it. And your descendants will probably face it until someone invents something revolutionary that changes everything. The fire burns. Your family sits around it, arranged by ancient patterns of heat distribution and social hierarchy. Outside, the winter night continues according to its own ancient patterns, indifferent to whether you're facing it alone in a single-family dwelling, collectively in a communal hall, comfortably in a Mediterranean courtyard, or efficiently under a heated table. Different strategies, same darkness, same fundamental challenge of staying alive, staying sane, and staying connected until spring arrives to release everyone from winter's grip. Your husband feeds the fire, your mother-in-law counts her rosary beads, your children shift position for the 900th time tonight. And somewhere across the world, other families are doing their own versions of the same thing, speaking different languages but facing the same ancient enemy, the long night that refuses to end. The first hint that dawn is approaching comes not from light, it's still pitch black outside, but from the rooster. Your insufferable rooster, who's been mercifully quiet for several hours, suddenly decides that 4:30 in the morning is when his services are needed. His crow echoes through the house with the subtlety of a trumpet blast, and you contemplate whether soup ingredients are really so hard to come by. But his instincts are right, even if his timing is aggressive. Morning is coming. Not here yet, not visible, but coming with the inevitability of seasons and celestial mechanics. The darkness that's held you captive since yesterday afternoon is finally loosening its grip. Your husband rises first, as always, to check the fire. The coals are still glowing, barely, but enough to coax back to life with kindling and patience. He feeds it carefully, building the flames back up, because starting the day with a dead hearth would mean 20 minutes of friction fire misery that no one wants. The fire catches, grows, spreads warmth back into the cold room. The day's cycle begins again. Your mother-in-law is already moving despite the darkness, despite her 73 years. She's got morning prayers to complete before dawn officially arrives. Specific devotions that mark the transition from night to day, from darkness to light, from vulnerability to relative safety. Her voice is quiet but steady, working through familiar Latin phrases that she probably doesn't fully understand but has been reciting for 7 decades. The words are comfort. The ritual is structure. The completion means you survived another night. Here's your mainstream historical fact about why dawn mattered so intensely to pre-industrial people. Darkness wasn't just inconvenient, it was genuinely dangerous. Fire risks increased at night. Accidents happened more easily. Predators were active. Human threats operated under cover of darkness. Making it through to morning meant you'd successfully navigated another period of elevated danger. Dawn wasn't just the return of light. It was confirmation that you'd survived. The children are stirring now, responding to the rooster's continued announcements and the sounds of adults moving around. Your son emerges from his blanket pile looking like a rumpled disaster. Your daughter is already mentally preparing for another day of the exact same tasks she did yesterday and will do tomorrow. But there's something in the air, an anticipation, an exhale of relief that comes with approaching sunrise. Outside, through the window that's been black all night, the darkness is beginning to shift. Not brighten exactly, but change quality, from the absolute void of deep night to the slightly less absolute void of pre-dawn. You can't see anything yet, but you can sense the change, feel it in your bones and your circadian rhythm and your deep ancestral memory of what dawn means. Your husband makes another pot of that terrible pine needle tea your mother-in-law swears by, because apparently we're starting the day with tree flavour. The children grimace but drink it anyway, because scurvy prevention trumps beverage enjoyment. Your mother-in-law sips hers with satisfaction, as if consuming boiled needles is actually pleasant rather than medicinal suffering. The animals are fully awake now, adding their voices to the morning symphony. The cow wants milking again. She's on a 12-hour cycle that doesn't care about your sleep preferences. The chickens are clucking urgently about breakfast. The sheep are bleating their opinions about something, probably cold or hunger or just general sheep anxiety. The pig is grunting hopefully. Your household's menagerie requires attention regardless of whether the sun has actually appeared. And then, finally mercifully, the first real light. It's not dramatic, not the golden sunrise of paintings and poetry. It's just a gradual lightening of the eastern window, a shift from black to deep blue to grey. But it's enough. Enough to see shapes instead of shadows. Enough to distinguish objects without candlelight. Enough to mark the official end of the long night's imprisonment. Your family has survived another one. 14 hours of darkness, cold, boredom, tedium, animal sounds, and the psychological weight of winter isolation. You made it through with textile work, food preparation, prayers, stories, music, awkward courtship, alcohol consumption, livestock management, nightmares, letter writing, and the sheer determination to not lose your mind before spring arrives. The sun will climb slowly into the winter sky, providing a few precious hours of daylight before the cycle starts again. But for now, in this moment, dawn is enough. The darkness is retreating. The day is beginning. You survived the night. And you know what? You've survived tonight too, listening to all of this. The grinding tedium, the cold calculations, the animal sounds and darkness, an endless winter stretching on and on. But here's the beautiful thing about history, about understanding how others lived. It makes your own life feel a little different. That light switch on your wall? That's not just convenience, it's freedom from the darkness that trapped humans for thousands of years. That thermostat? It's liberation from the mathematics of survival that governed every winter decision. Those long winter nights shaped everything about how humans organized society, maintained relationships, passed down knowledge, and structured meaning in their lives. The darkness wasn't empty time. It was when families bonded, when stories were preserved, when skills transferred, when traditions formed that would echo through centuries. So as you drift off now, in your warm room with your electric lights and your climate control and your screens that push back the darkness whenever you want, maybe spare a thought for all those people who sat by failing fires, who counted hours until dawn, who turned necessity into ritual and ritual into culture. They endured. They adapted. They found meaning in the spaces between sunset and sunrise, and in their endurance they created something worth remembering, not despite the darkness, but because of it. The long winter nights forced humans to be creative, to be social, to be resilient. The struggle wasn't wasted. It built the world that eventually built the world you live in now. So rest easy. Let the darkness outside your window be just darkness, not threat, not prison, just night. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts drift, your body settle into the comfort that millions of ancestors never knew but desperately wanted. You've earned it. We all have. The long night is over. Dawn always comes. And now, finally, mercifully, you can sleep.